Thank you for everyone joining this Super Salon with Kevin Kelly. We're orienting this around the theme of Kevin's recent book, The Art of Living, and which he called The Excellent Advice for Living. And you can check that out where all books are sold. I actually got the privilege of interviewing Kevin several months back about his book. So I'm sort of co-hosting this and going to let Ashley Zhang take the lead in facilitating this session. Generally, we wanted to orient it around how do we build a life of ideas on the internet? How do we find the others through virtual communities like this? Talk about technology, AI, wherever things can take us. I think Kevin is definitely a living embodiment of a lot of the lives we aspire towards and are trying to prototype, practice in our lives. And excited to have him here. So welcome, Kevin. I'll let Ashley briefly introduce you, and appreciate you being here.
My pleasure. So much. I'm so excited to see all you folks, but thank you for having me.
Lovely. And thank you, Paul. It's really, as he said, such an honor and a pleasure. And I'm so excited to see so many new and familiar faces. Kevin Kelly, I'm sure if you're here, know him to some degree, but he is a true jack of all trades. And I think spiritually intellect before Intercept was born. Currently, he's Senior Maverick at Wired, which is an amazing award-winning magazine. He co-founded in 1993 on technology and our relation to it. He's also co-chair of the Long Now Foundation, which fosters long-term thinking. He's founded many cool websites, and he's written multiple best-selling books about the future of technology. And before his work as a technologist, he was a nomadic photojournalist in Asia. So he's led a very beautiful and eclectic life, and he's a self-proclaimed radical optimist in a time, I think, sorely in need of optimistic and beautiful and humane visions for the future. So I think we're going to structure this. We have a few framing questions for the first maybe 20-ish minutes, and then we'd love to open it up to everyone here. So if you have any questions throughout this conversation, please just type it into the chat, and then around 9:30, we'll just start going down the list and having it be more of an open conversation. So Anna, I don't know if you have any words to add.
I'm good. I'm just here as an attendee, and this is a dream come true. Kevin, welcome to Intellect. This is the home that you didn't know you had.
That's right. This is my tribe for sure. And again, I'm really delighted to be here, and looking forward to this conversation wherever it may go. Just given the intelligence of everybody here, I'm sure it's going to be very interesting. So thank you.
Lovely. And for context, Anna's the wonderful founder of this community, Intellect, and well, we can go into that more at the end. I guess I wanted to start this conversation with the very broad question of, when you reflect on your life and look back at all the varied things that you've done, what do you think is the thread that connects your many disparate pursuits?
I think it's a very tenuous thread. I tend to do things that I'm just curious about, and so I learned early on that lesson that we all probably have learned ourselves, which is to kind of follow our curiosity. That's sort of one of the most valuable things that we have. And I, for some reason, as a kid in high school, decided that I wasn't ever going to be rich, and so I was going to do things that were just interesting to me and follow my own curiosity. And I was kind of signing up for the non-career, which was very radical. It was kind of part of the hippie thing in the 60s, and so my life has, I really kind of tried to follow the curiosity, and more than anything else. And I kind of pretended that it had $1 billion when actually it had no money at all. And the idea was like, I would just pretend that I could afford to do things and then figure out ways to do them, whether it's traveling or building a house or whatever it was. And so that's have served me well, I guess. And that's the connection between the individual projects are no more than just my curiosity.
Mm. And what inspired you to pursue a non-career? Was it a book, a person, just a gut feeling?
I'm not sure, because there wasn't anybody in my life that was like that, but I read Walden, or Henry David Thoreau, Walden, when I was in high school, and he was my hero. That kind of doing your own thing, building a house, and kind of living life very intently. And I think that was maybe the most influence at that time. Later on, a few years later, I saw the Whole catalog and Stuart Brand's work, and that was my permission slip. That was the moment when I actually decided to really invent my life, just sort of make it up, because now I had role models besides Thoreau, more modern people who were very aware of what they were doing and were telling me that all these things were possible, like build your own house, like travel the world, like repair your own car. These were all things that I had no idea were really possible. And then there were people who were doing it, and they're saying, yeah, you can do all these things. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is the golden ticket.
And you mentioned Stuart Brand, who I know was a great mentor and friend to you and still is. I was wondering how you find peers and mentors as you're carving your own path, because there aren't really obvious bubbles, except perhaps like Interintellect, where you can find similarly oriented like weirdos who are in the process of self-authorship.
For some reason, a lot of my mentors existed in between pages of a book. I was a big believer in reading and what you could learn from books, and you can't really tell, but I'm in a 2-story library, surrounded by books, and so that was most of my mentors were sort of in books themselves, and until I met Stuart, and he was a real person, and he had friends, and then working with them, and that was, I guess, yeah, I deliberately went to the Whole Earth Catalog to work there, and so it took me a long time to actually be hired, because in the beginning I didn't have anything to offer. I wasn't valuable to them, and it took me a while to have something to offer, but then when I did, it was a good fit, and so that's a piece of advice that I now talk about for my kids, which is it's really hard to kind of know what you're really good at when you're young, and it's really hard to kind of decide. Sometimes people don't even have a passion in the beginning, but I counsel that you should become master of something. You should become expert at something, and it doesn't really matter what it is. Just something that you're better at than most people, or maybe even better than anybody. And that thing may not be the thing you want to do all your life, but it will become a platform. It will become a bridge. It will become a way in which you can then find that thing. And so that's what I needed at Whole Earth, was to become expert on something. And what I became expert at was budget travel. All right. And it was like, I just traveled so much, and I became so informed about places in the world that people weren't going to, that I was involved with Rick Steves, Lonely Planet, and all those people in the early days of budget travel. And I knew a lot, and that was my entry into Whole Earth. I was then expert on traveling in low cost in Asia. And so I didn't want to stay there, but that's sort of where that was the entry. So you need to become master of something as a way of kind of finding what you're what you're the best in.
And how do you determine what is worthy of your efforts and your mastery or attempt at mastery? And also, like, say, of course, there will be challenges in the way, but when do you know when it's time to give up or pivot or reinvent yourself?
Man, it'd be great if there was a formula for that, but there's not. That's the art. I say, you want to have the determination to never give up. You want to have the wisdom to give up when it's necessary, and you want to have friends to help you decide between the two. I think it actually takes other people to help you make that decision of when you pivot, when you surrender and move on. I think it's really hard to do it only by yourself. You need kind of outside data. And so it is that kind of, and it's interesting to me that my view of the human character is that it's that your virtues and vices, your strengths and weaknesses are actually the same dimension, just opposite poles. So like the difference between persistence and stubbornness is very thin. The difference between generosity and foolishness is pretty thin. And so I think the difference between the positive and negative version of those kinds of things is your ego, to the extent that you're doing it in an ego way or in a selfless way. So if you're persistent, and if you never give up on things that matter, that's persistence. If you never give up on things that don't matter, that's stubbornness. And so I think it's really tough to kind of be aware of your best things by yourself. I think we need everybody here. You need all the people around you. You need a village to actually make you unique. I don't think we can become unique by ourselves. It's kind of a paradox. It's weird that you can't become a unique individual all by yourself. You actually require everyone around you to help you become unique. And so I'm really, I think that's part of this process of like when you surrender, when you give up. I think you need other people's views of you and what you're doing to help you come to those kind of decisions.
And you've written about, like, I guess you've been a prophet of some sort, like networks of like digital communities and cultivating friendships on the internet before this was really a thing. So how do you think digital communities can think about cultivating trust and intimacy? I feel like there's still this like huge gap to be bridged between like in-person friendships and also just like meeting people who you could really click with on a much deeper level.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think this is kind of a frontier in a certain way, because I mean, communities are not new to humans. We've been involved in a long time, but they were most of the time. I had a friend, John Barlow, who used to define real communities as one that you didn't have a choice about, that you couldn't leave. And that was what growing up in his little town in Wyoming was like, you could kind of leave, but it's like having a family. You were kind of stuck with people and you had to work it out. And we're now trying to make communities in a very different way, different kind of environment where people have a lot of choice to come and go. And so I think it's a kind of a frontier of learning how to collaborate in different ways than we have in the past. Like, say planetarily, right now, just looking at the people here coming from so many different parts of the world. And then we're going to try to collaborate in real time. And there's all kinds of physical things, there's time differences, we have language issues, there's so many things. And I think this is an incredible opportunity to invent new ways of collaboration and community. And I think we should, what's the word I want? I think we should honor the fact that we don't know. I mean, there aren't a lot of received wisdom about that. We know some things about, how to maintain friendships loosely, how to work with lots of people who have different opinions, but I think we're also headed, this is kind of a new territory in terms of collaborating at scale. I mean, that was one of the things that we're now doing. I mean, the number of people here is like, this was a size of a clan in the past, but we can do even bigger. And so how do you do 1 million people? Can you do a community with 1 million people? Is that even possible? Or is it Dunbar's number that's the limit? We don't even know. We can still figure things out. And I think that's the exciting thing of what you're doing, is of trying to see the different ways, all the different ways we can arrange human connection. And some of them aren't going to work. That's fine. Some of them might work. Some of them might work halfway. And so I think this period right now where we're trying lots of different things is really very exciting. And I don't have any, I don't think we know the answers about how we do this. And you probably have more knowledge about this than anybody at this point.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting thing. A lot of us are in these emergent communities, and I've met a lot of people in person too. And there's all these things like network state, Bology's doing. There's this experiment Zuzulu Vitalik was doing earlier this year. What you probably saw a lot of the intentional communities in the 70s and 60s. Right. What are we missing? What mistakes are we repeating? Is this just a cycle we go through over and over again? Yeah, I see a lot of people in my generation. Let's all move together and form an intentional community. And you read history, and it's like this was happening prior to the Civil War too.
Yeah, exactly. Americans have a lot of from Vineland and onwards, Oneonta. Yeah, so there's a whole tradition of intentional communities. I mean, they're difficult. They're difficult to maintain. I would say that I'm not an expert on the dynamics of them. I have never lived in the commune, but man, I have lots of friends who have, and I have no interest in living on a commune at this point, just given what I know from what happens. It's really tough. But the good news is that there is a long history. There is there is something we can learn from the past about this, so you can avoid. I did, for those who are interested at Whole Earth, it was called, I think it was CQ at the time, Coevolution Quarterly, which is now up on publicly. So we have a full scan of the whole Earth catalogs and all the publications, and they're really, really great. You can read this, but I did an exit interview with all the people, all the guys and girls, they were adults at that point, who lived on the farm in Tennessee with Stephen Gaskin, which was one of the biggest communes it was very successful. They were really doing really interesting stuff. And they were there for decades, and they finally left. And they came in as teenagers, and they were totally communist. They had no individual money. And they finally left, and they came and they started the well. They were the first guys on the well doing the community building for the well, were these people who had been living communally. And so that was very, very important in kind of trying to make the new culture. We were like the first real online community. We were the first public access to the internet. And so, but I did an exit interview where I was interviewing them and what worked on their commune and what didn't work and why they left and why they were there. And if anybody was trying to make a kind of an intentional commune of that nature, which was where you shared money or didn't share money, or I would say you shared what little money you had, they should read it, because it was really, really revealing. So I think, what do I know? I know that the ones that worked over time seem to seem to make it easy to come and go. I think the ones that were having difficulty was ones where leaving became a stigma, where you were betraying people, where you were in some ways betraying the people who were there, and that was the beginning of usually very, very strange dynamics in it. And so the ones that were a little bit more casual about people coming and going seem to survive a little bit longer in terms of longevity. But that's only one dimension about these things. There could be things where you can have intentional communities and their intent is to be there for 5 years and then disappear. So longevity is only one of those dimensions, but it was a very rare one. There could be other metrics that you used about whether something succeeded or not. And I think that, to me, is the excitement, is that you could, and this is what I tell young people, is come up with your own definition of success. All right, that's what you want. And so part of what we want with these communities is new definitions of what is successful. Right. And so longevity is one thing, but not the only thing. There are other ways to measure impact. There are ways to measure what people get out of them. And I think that's part of what is going on, is coming up with some new definitions of success.
When you were talking, I was thinking like the line between a strong community and a cult is very thin.
It is. Right. Yeah. And if you can't leave, then it's a cult.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask, how do you currently define success for yourself, and how has that evolved over the years?
That's a fair question. Great question. So two things. One is I'm trying to maximize my learning. It's like that. If my business is giving talks and speeches, and it's really like, well, in addition to giving talks, I need to be learning something. I don't want to do this unless I am also learning at the same time. And like here, this is a great example. I'm learning all kinds of things about what you guys are interested in and what's happening here. And so that's a reason for me to do this. And so that's one thing, is optimizing my learning. But the second thing that more and more I try and read as a success is I'm really interested in spending my time, investing my time in the kinds of things that only I would do, that no one else would want to do, or could do. And so a very common question that I ask myself when I have an idea about whether there's something I want to do is, this would be really fun. I would really like this. I think I'd be pretty good at doing this. I could probably even earn some money doing it. But then the fourth question, because the first three are the kind of holy trinity for most people, but there's a fourth question, a fourth level, which is, can anybody else do this? Would anybody else do this? Because if someone else could do it or would do it, then I'm not going to do it, because that means that I'm not the only one who could do it. I want to get to the point, and I've been trying that, is where no one else is going to do it, so I'm the only one doing it. And when that is true, it's a relief, because suddenly there's no competition. I'm not in a hurry. I can take my time. I can do it whatever way I want. I'm not in a race, and it's mine. And one of the ways I get to that is I am a big believer in trying to give away my ideas. When I have an idea, I start trying to give it away. I tell everybody about the idea. I tell everything I know about it. I'm trying to sell it. I'm hoping someone will steal it, because if they steal it, that means, someone else could have done it. I don't have to do that. And so if I can't get anybody to steal my ideas after a couple of years, I can do it now. And so, so that is one of the ways I would rank success. Success for me is, and this is a bit of advice I have in the book, is I know not aiming to be the best. I'm aiming to be the only. And I think that's a much better place to aim for.
Wonderful. Paul, do you have any last questions before we open it up?
Yeah, we Ashley and I were talking before the event, and if you have questions for Kevin, start putting them in the chat, and we'll call on you guys to ask them. And if you want to ask questions of us, the group too, Kevin,
yeah, I will take advantage of that for sure.
Let you do that as well. But I was thinking about, like, when you're reinventing yourself, you're shifting between different things throughout your life. You can operate without any sort of psychological coherence of how anything fits together. Do you have periods where you embrace that uncertainty? Do you have other periods where you like, okay, I need to figure out how this all makes sense? How do you deal with like the own story you tell yourself about what you're up to?
It's a good question. Yeah. So I'm working on a project right now, and this project, I have no idea whether it could possibly even work, whether it's going to be successful, whether it's going to be useful, and I'm fine with that. It doesn't bother me. I guess I could say I'm comfortable with that uncertainty, and I think there are other times when maybe for certain conditions where I'm not comfortable knowing that, and I want more clarity. So I would say it kind of depends, and it varies. But I'm probably a little bit more comfortable with uncertainty than maybe most people. And I'd like when I travel, or like when I travel, I will go into areas where I have literally no idea what's going to happen, where I'm going. And I like to get lost in that sense. Other people find that very, very uncomfortable, but I'm perfectly happy to deliberately try to get lost, meaning like I literally don't know where I am. And that kind of uncertainty, because I know that I will discover something really cool for me. And so maybe I've had enough practice in that kind of thing. And I think maybe that's another way of saying is you can practice being comfortable with uncertainty. It's something you can kind of work on. And you do it enough, you kind of know that it's going to work out. And writing is a little bit like that, where you in the beginning it's very messy. The first draft sucks. But you have enough experience to know that you're going to work through that. The guys at Pixar talk about that all the time, that every movie sucks and their entire job is to unsuck the movie over time, right? It starts off really, really sucking. All of them do. And they have a sucky movie. And so their process is, they know of a process which they can trust, which will unsuck the movie till it gets to the unsuckable end. And so, I think there's a little bit of that you can learn to sit with, not knowing, fundamentally, not knowing whether this is even worth doing. And sometimes it isn't. But mostly you kind of work on unsucking it over time.
I want to ask like one final question just because I'm curious. Have you had any major regrets in your life?
Yeah. Not too many. Not too many. I have 3 kids, and I've talked about the fact that we tried and regret that we didn't have a 4th. My unsolicited advice to everybody present is to have as many kids as you possibly can, because you will never regret that. So that's one regret. But no, by and large, I don't have a lot of regrets. Jeff Bezos talks about regret minimization, of kind of trying to make decisions that would minimize regrets. And most people, Dan Pink did a whole book on regret. And by and large, most people, older people, when they listed their regrets, were about not things that they did, but things that they did not do. So if you were a doer, you're more likely not to have regrets. If you're someone who doesn't do things, then so I think that's a good thing, is try to say yes as much as possible.
Wonderful. Okay, I could continue to pepper Kevin with questions, but let's open it up to the group. I think, Paul, unless you saw, is Kevin McMurphy's the first question? I've been kind of scrolling, but I don't know, Paul, if you've been.
Yeah, I think Will had a couple earlier on. Will, do you want to unmute and ask, and then we'll get to you, Kevin?
Sure. My first question was, have you had kind of, when you were talking about kind of following your interest, following your curiosity, have you had any, because right, you can't choose everything to be the skill that you really pursue mastery. And so have you had any memorable kind of forks in the road where you picked one or the other, or any paths that got away from you?
Yeah, I was always interested in art and science, and couldn't decide whether to go to art school or MIT. And eventually I dropped out after a year because I kind of went to the technical side, and I probably should have gone to art school. Maybe I would have completed it, but I found photography, and photography for me in the 1970s, early 60s, when you had to do the chemistry yourself and all the optics, it was a very, very technical thing. And for me, photography was sort of the nice melding of art and technology, and art and the technical, and because it was a very technical thing. So I was really trying to become a photographer, and I wanted to become a National Geographic photographer. And I started down that road. And when I first left my first trip, I was 19 years old, new to photography, and I went to the telephone book and I called up National Geographic, one of their editors, and I told them, I'm headed to Taiwan and in Japan. Do you need any photographs? And they said, that's not how it works here. But when you come back, show me your pictures. And I started doing that. The guy was just really fabulous. And I was on my way to, become a professional photographer. But what happened was I started to meet actual other National Geographic photographers on the road and stuff. And I saw what their lives were like, and I decided that was not what I really wanted. The actual life of a professional photographer was not my idea. That's not what I wanted to spend my time doing. And so I made this shift to like, okay, I'll write more, or my captions were getting longer. I'll be much more interested in actually the text around the photographs. And so I headed much more towards trying to learn how to write, away from just the image. Of course, when we went into Wired, that was, my background and kind of the visuals was part of what Wired was about, was this melding of the very visual and the writing. So it was perfect for me. But the point was that I saw what the day-to-day lives of professional photographers were. It was like not that appealing to me. And it's always, by the way, shocked me from a number of people that I've met who decide they want to become a lawyer or a doctor or something, and then go through the whole training, and then after the first year of actually doing it, they can't stand it. And it's like, did you not ever shadow a lawyer or doctor? Did you not ever intern to see what actually the day-to-day life is? You should really do that if you have aspiration, is get a little taste of what that actually means to practice, rather than what you kind of imagined. And that's what happened to me, was seeing, I was imagining what a professional National Geographic photographer's life was like, and it was nothing like that.
Kevin, and then Anna.
You're muted. Yeah.
Should unmute. Yeah. Just kind of following up on that curiosity piece. I'm like you, just probably like everybody in this room, insatiably curious. But that leads me down rabbit holes that are really distracting, or what a lot of the world would call really distracting, right? Maybe we're finding out something different here. What does it look like for you to practically chase curiosity? And does that help you with intentional decision making, like you said, on where you want to end up?
Yeah, I have sort of surrendered to the idea of wasting time. I think wasting time is really, really important for creativity. And I think that's the difference between the young and the old, is the young are really good at wasting time. They'll spend 100 hours playing a video game. And anybody old or middle aged just can't afford that, and I think that's to their detriment. And so, I'm a much bigger believer in goofing off, wasting time, following the rabbit hole down to the bottom. I don't see these distractions. I see these distractions as valuable over the long term, and if it, like anything, it could be an addiction. It does prevent you from actually, having human relationships and all this other kind of stuff. Then that would become a problem. But I think intellectually, I don't see a big problem with it. I actually see a big benefit, and that is you're much more unlikely to uncover something that no one else really is thinking about or cares about, and that's the only way to get there. It's those idle diversions, so to speak, that actually can become the main event later on for most people in a good way, because otherwise you're just with the herd. You're just following everything else everyone else is following, and you're unlikely to be anywhere different. And so I actually revel in those rabbit holes. And yes, as long as you are enjoying it. I mean, if you're some weird thing where you hate yourself doing, okay, well then you need to look at that. But if you really enjoy it, it's, in the end, I think it's going to pay off.
And are you protecting time to do that?
In a certain sense, this, I don't know if I can say this, but it's like, I actually think like this is the main thing. Like, you do all these other things so that you can spend an hour following some weird Wikipedia thing. That's the whole purpose. It's not like you're trying to that this is sort of, again, some diversion. I'm saying that in some ways I arrange my life so that I can follow the Wikipedia trail to somewhere. I am living at that moment in a certain way. I'm following my curiosity. It's not like, yeah, we can say it's wasting time, but actually what I'm trying to say is not a waste. It's another thing. It's actually the thing to be doing.
So it's the inverse. You're time boxing the other things.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
Anna?
Kevin, let me just add, it's the 1 hour on Wikipedia. We all know it's more like 7.
Yeah, right. That's true.
And then the sun is rising and everybody's angry at you. And
Well, and for me, by the way, it's YouTube. My YouTube is my thing. So yeah, but it's the same thing.
The rabbit holes. Indeed, I think I was a freshman in college when Wikipedia happened, and oh boy, that was good timing. I'm still grateful to Jimmy for having pulled that off, and he was with us recently at a salon, and we collectively thanked him for ruining our family lives forever. Actually, my question, I think, is related to that. Interact, we like to be a little bit decadent, a little bit pointless, because we think that the best things come from productively wasting our time. And if it's done together, it's even better. But I'm a millennial, and I noticed that in my generation, most of the people who are trying to follow your example and give other people advice, unsolicited or not, will kind of fall into either the productivity advice category or self-care. To me, it always feels a little bit navel-gazing, that I think we are more attached to each other as humans than just one person to be able to solve their own productivity or their own balance of their soul. How do you see that generational trend? Is this just the surface, and they are actually trying to say something else that we should be listening to? How do you feel when you run into that onslaught of content?
So I'm still parsing your question. So how do I feel when I encounter young people who are
productivity advice, self-care advice as kind of the main areas of advice?
Yeah.
When it comes to advice giving content.
So you're saying like curiosity is like orthogonal to those,
or communality.
Yeah, I may not understand the question enough to answer, but I don't maybe I don't know or have much contact with the young people who are giving advice that you know. But I mean, I know Tim Ferriss, right? So there's Tim Ferriss, and he began a very productivity oriented and has become much more touchy-feely over time. So I'm not really sure what the phenomena is that I may not have as much experience with that.
Maybe for the better. Maybe we'll just
yeah.
We'll see.
We'll see.
Let's see, who do we have? I think Ellen asked a question, and then we'll do Adam.
Hello.
Hi.
I would like to know what have you learned from the Long Now Foundation, and how has that changed your own perspective on long-term thinking?
Yeah. Great question. So thank you. For the benefit of those who may not know the Long Now Foundation, it was established 26 years ago to encourage and promote long-term thinking, and what we also call long-term imagination and long-term responsibility. So anyway, the long-term perspective. And I think that's been very, very clarifying for me, because there were things that I had hunches about that I was able to articulate over that span. We've been running a seminar series for 20 years, and we invite people to give a talk about long-term thinking. It's like in the beginning, we said, we don't know what this is. Some tell us what long-term thinking means. And so we've had, 300, 400 talks about people interpreting it in their way. And I think what I learned was one of the ways that I have become more optimistic over time is by taking a longer view. That the longer the view you take, both of the past and of the future, the easier it is to be optimistic. And because what you understand is that civilization is sort of an accumulation of these little tiny wins, these little tiny incremental betterment that are not really visible in the present. A 1% betterment is not really visible, except in the past you see this accumulated over time. And as going forward, if your horizon is not the next quarter or next new 2 years, but 10 years or 20 years, it permits you to overcome all kinds of fairly major setbacks, can be overcome over the long term. And that helps me become even more optimistic than I have. So I think I would say, in short, one of the things I got from it, the change, was my deliberate shift to becoming more optimistic over time. And by the way, my optimism is not just a personality, it's also a choice. And I've deliberately become more optimistic because of that long view, that long now sort of illuminated.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, being interested in the Long Now Foundation, and I donated to the interval when it was starting up, and
Well,
all
thank
that.
you.
And I've listened to some of the talks, so I think it's changed my perspective over time too.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah. So the idea is that what we'd like to have is what we call generational thinking, where maybe some of the benefits, or maybe even most of the benefits, accrued not to the people starting the project, but later on. So you build a road, and maybe the road is costly, but maybe the road doesn't pay for itself for 10, 15 years or to another generation. That's worth doing. And a lot of the things that we benefit from our own lives today were built in the past and took a while to pay off. And so you're kind of investing into the future generations, and saying, this is, the long-termism, which is a little different, which is that most of the people who will ever live will be born in the future. And so we sort of owe the future something. And I think that's true to some extent. It's not entirely, the future shouldn't hijack the present, but we think we can make a better civilization by paying more attention to the future of future generations.
So people want to hear a bit more about this optimism. So I'm sort of thinking, like, I sort of optimism pilled myself through the creative work. And I left the corporate path behind, started goofing off a little more, started doing writing, and became a lot more optimistic in the process. What are some of the on-ramps you've seen in people? Like, I see so many people that are sort of attached to their own cynicism in a way that I don't actually know how to give people on-ramps onto an optimistic worldview.
Yeah. Well, it's tough. And for me, what the first thing is a longer view of the past and of the future. So the long view of the past is that if you take a very, very fair, scientific, rational look at the world, you have to admit the reality of progress. Let's say the last 300 or 400 years. And so all the conditions that generate that positive impact over time are still at work. And so that progress is highly likely to continue. It could stop tomorrow for some weird reason, but it's very unlikely. So statistically, that progress will continue. So you can become more optimistic the more you study history, the more you really look at history. So that's the second thing, is the longer view. And then really the most optimistic futurists I know are all really great historians. So invest into history. And then the other thing that I find is if you understand that bad things happen fast and good things, all good things take time, they happen slowly, it means that the news of any type, the highest quality news, whatever it is, by definition is going to be bad news. Okay, so if your world is framed by the news, what's happened in the past week or 2 weeks or even the year, it's going to be hard to be optimistic because it's all going to be bad news. If we only rate headlines every 10 years, they'd be very, very optimistic. It'd be much different. And so try not to be misled by news in general, which by definition is going to be reporting. I can tell you that whatever happened in the last 5 hours is bad news, right? And so if you're framing around the news, it's going to be pessimistic. So you have to get out of that and look at history and look at the longer view and understand that, pay attention to science. Science is really the only new news, and don't have your view of the world framed by the news. So that's, I find, very, very useful. So it doesn't mean that you have to never look at it, but it means that you really don't want it to be dominant in your view of what's going on. And I would say one last thing. One last thing about it, and that is one of the reasons to be optimistic as you possibly can is that, first of all, everything in our world that you admire, that we like, was created by an optimistic person, a person who believed that change was possible when most people did not. And so if we are to make really good future, if we were to make good things in the future, or even a good future that we want, it's very hard to do it inadvertently. It's very hard to do that accidentally. It actually requires to have a vision of what it is. Those little communicators in Star Trek were incredibly influential in people making the smartphone. All right. And so you want to be able to see something, because it makes it much more likely that it will happen. And that act of imagining a future that works and believing that it can be done, that's optimism. So the future is going to be, our future will be shaped by the optimists of today. And so if you want to shape the future, you need to be as optimistic as you possibly can.
Beautiful. Did you have something to add on that, Anna?
Oh yeah, thank you so much. First of all, I love this. Even the preventative measures are built by people who at least are optimistic enough that it will work.
Right.
I just, when I studied Interact in 2016, October 2016, the first 1 year, I was so kind of influenced by the headlines that you're mentioning. And this whole thing was 180 degrees the other way around. It was preventative. It was trying to solve human discourse by, putting in different shields so people can shape their experience. We were living in the chatbot panic, the Facebook panic, and everybody was burying technology with a big cross on it. And then I had this little voice, and I thought, what if I tried something where there are no fences? We just trust people. We create rules. We read James Cars and create an infinite game that can just happen. And the more I do it, and I think I'm probably the person in my organization who has been to the most salons, both online and offline, the more time you spend with people, I think it's impossible not to become more optimistic. I mean, here is Paul. Paul started, appearing in my online network before his book, before his baby, before his world trip. It's impossible to observe people through your community across any span of time and not be optimistic by all the amazing things they are doing.
Sure. Yeah, you're right.
The photos from their trips. And I think one of the best things to tell people who want to be more optimistic is just spend more time with people.
Mm-hmm.
Really,
particularly young people. That's another source. Is I like to hang out with my children's friends because you can be because it gets easier to trust the future. I mean, this is what I would say. Another reason to be optimistic is I'm optimistic not because I believe that our problems are smaller than we thought. We have huge problems, and we're going to have even bigger ones in the future. I'm optimistic because I think our capacity to solve problems is bigger than we thought. Okay? And that's what the next generation is. They will be able to solve more problems than we are. So you're trusting the future. So yeah. So it's my optimism lies not in denying our problems, but embracing our ability to keep solving problems even better.
I love that. And was Adam next?
Yeah, I think Adam. And then Tim.
Okay.
Or did you
cool.
ask already, Adam? Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, excellent. Well, I think you and I are the only two guys in here over 65.
I don't know that for sure, but I'm definitely over 65.
I am as well. So I think I first connected with Paul when I texted him something about his book and the fact that I've been on a path for 40 some years, and you know what, it wasn't all that bad, but one day I decided I'd get off, and now I'm off. The question, of course, is what's next? I'm particularly enthusiastic about your enthusiasm for optimism. And I think, well, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is I
froze.
Wow, right when I got exciting. Let's wait a bit and then see if he gets back on. Paul, I think you're muted.
I'm still optimistic that Wi-Fi will eventually just be seamless.
all right.
Oh, Adam's back.
Okay.
Oh, you're back, Adam.
I'm back.
Yes, you are back.
You
I
broke off right when you were talking about optimism.
I have an amazingly expensive high-speed internet connection here, and I'm not going to tell you who the provider is because obviously it's not working all that well. The optimism is obviously.
Oh, well, he's having a glitch.
It's a pessimistic internet provider.
That's right. Doesn't want him to say anything.
Let's see who. I think we had. All right. Who wanted to ask a follow-up question? It said, how do you figure out if you can be the only one doing the thing you can do? That was Adam's question.
Yeah, that's
Adam, was that Adam, you're back now. Was that your question? How do you figure out how you can be the only one?
That was one question. I'm going to just ask one more in case I blot out again. I'm looking for a way not to be a Kevin Kelly, but to be like a Kevin Kelly who has 40 to 50 years of stuff that I've done. And in 3 to 4 times in my career, I have actually been the only one doing what I was doing. I want to be able to pay that back or pay it forward or whatever definition. I don't have a need to feed my ego. I know how to get some stuff done. And I'd like to be able to be a guy who I just turned 71, still got some hair, haven't lost my sense of humor quite yet, and they haven't crushed the curiosity out of me. I'd like to figure out a way to be more intergenerationally active. I mean, my baby's 31 years old. The other one's 37, and they're doing terrifically. And by the way, they're having babies, which I see as an amazing vote of confidence in the world and in America. But how do I figure out the best way to figure out what the best way to communicate what I've done that might be helpful to somebody else? And, you know, obviously you're doing that because you have a voice and a platform. I think there are many more of us out there who could be able to do that.
Yeah. Let me address your first question was how do you figure out your onlyness? And I think first of all, it takes your lifetime. I think it's not something that it's not a destination. It's a direction. And that I've had the privilege of hanging around with a lot of very successful billionaires, people who have billions of dollars. We would call, most people would call them successful in some capacity. And the shock is that they are still asking the question of what they want to do when they grow up.
Yeah.
Having $1 billion does not answer that question. In fact, it complicates it. In fact, here's a bit of advice I would say to everybody here. Try as hard as you can to never have $1 billion. Okay? You do not want to have $1 billion. A couple $100 million, okay, fine, but not $1 billion. It's very toxic and imprisoning and distorting and terrible for your kids. But the thing is that it doesn't answer the question of how to be the only still, because they've done something. Maybe it's sometimes a lot of luck involved, and they still are trying to figure it out. And so when you're young, it's very rare for someone to kind of know exactly what they're really better at or different at or the only at. And it takes a long life to kind of figure out. I'm still working on it, and it's not done. It's not a destination. You're always moving in that direction. And so I think that's the best you can hope for is, are you moving in that direction? Are you moving somewhere where you have more of a sense of what it is? And one of the ways I think you can tell, one of the signs, is, are you working at a place where people don't have language for what it is that you're doing? There's no name for what it is that you're doing. I'm sure a lot of people here are working on things, or maybe full-time, where there's not a good term for what it is that you're doing. There's no occupation. There's no title. It takes 15 minutes for you to explain to your parents what it is that you actually do all day. That's a good sign that you're on your way to being the only, because there's no label for it. And as much as you can, you want to be working in those areas where you're ahead of the language, where you're working where there's no words for what it is that you actually do. So I would say that's one of the indicators that you're on the right path, and that it's a path. It's not a destination.
And I think the second question was around, I guess, sharing your wisdom with future generations. I guess you have your book, which I guess you can plug again.
Well, yeah. Oh, my book, I plug. Yes. Okay. So here's the book. It's called Excellent Advice for Living. It's very, very easy read. One of the Wired veteran writers, Stephen Levy, gave me some advice. He's written lots of books, much more than I have. He said there's an inverse relationship to the length of the book and the sales. The shorter the book, the more it sells. So I decided to I tend to make overwhelmingly big books. And so this was an attempt to make the smallest book I could possibly do. It's 450 aphorisms and little proverbs. It's kind of the Bible without any stories. Most advice books tell stories, which is a really great way to tell it. But I decided to just give you the punchline. That's my style. I'm more telegraphic. And so there are just little bits of wisdom, as I've been sort of indicating, but pros make as many mistakes as amateurs. They just learned how to gracefully recover from their mistakes. So don't worry about making mistakes. That even professionals do, but they're different is that they're really good at recovering from mistakes. And that's the sign of professional. You all make mistakes, but you want to be able to recover from them very well. So you work on recovery. So anyway, I have a book like that. That's sort of what it's about. But I think one of the reasons I have friends who work in academia and universities, and they can make a lot more money in the private world, but the reason they stay is because they get to work with young people. They have students, young students, and that for them is priceless. That is the payoff that keeps them young. And so that's one way to kind of do the intergenerational thing is to work with students as much as you can. And I think we have so many avenues for sharing right now that this is it's never been as good of a place right now to be able to share what you're doing. So I think everybody should be sharing to the extent that they're comfortable with it, and maybe a little bit more. And you can tell, what's the word I want? The feedback, you should be open to the feedback for it. And that is the real skill. The real skill is not in sharing, which we have technology to, but to learn from what you share, to read and to use that feedback is important, because again, it goes back to this paradox that you need the whole village to make you unique. You also have to follow and ignore the customer and ignore other people, but you also have to pay attention to them, because they have some data. So the bit of advice that I use in the book is like, when someone tells you that something does not work, they are right. When they tell you what the solution is, they're usually wrong. Okay? This is the whole thing that Pixar, this system was of like taking notes. So when people are telling you things that aren't working, they're usually right. And you need to pay attention to that. When they tell you how to fix it, you can ignore it. They're usually wrong. And that's where your genius have to come in, is actually coming up with that solution. But when you're sharing, you want to be open to the feedback, and people are going to tell you where it doesn't work. And so you actually want to listen to that. That is actually incredibly valuable in terms of moving forward. But when they tell you how to fix it, ignore them. You need to retreat to your own genius to figure out that.
We have about 25 minutes left. I told you I'd give you the opportunity to ask us questions. We do like to keep these sessions back and forth open. Do you have questions for us, Kevin?
Yeah.
What do you want to know from people?
Yeah. So I'm always. I have a couple questions that they're going to be maybe difficult, but to answer. I'm interested in where is what's a subculture right now, where there's anywhere in the world that the people are not paying attention to, and that maybe I should pay attention to. So I'm interested in that's one of the reasons why I like documentaries. I'm a big fan of documentaries, because it can take me into a little world that I knew nothing about, and they can immerse me into that. And so I'm aware that there's just tons of little subcultures, little communities that are doing things richly and deeply, and I'm unaware. And so if someone can introduce me to one of those, I'll track it down. And it could be like a documentary that you saw, that you'd recommend, or that that you have some hobby and there's a very devoted community to it. Maybe they're left-handed quilters. I don't know. I'm just always eager to see another obsession in the world that might be interesting. And the VCs like Mark Andreessen, he was saying one of his rules of thumb for investing, and it was he would ask the founders, what their hobbies were, what they did for fun, and then he would invest into that. It was not what they were pitching. It was, how are you having fun? What are you really obsessed with when you're not obsessed with work? And so that's another way of framing it, is like, is there can you point me to a group that's obsessed with something that maybe I should know about?
Yeah, what is 40K lore, Tim?
Oh no. Oh no. Well, so 40K are like tabletop miniatures.
Oh, okay.
Well, 40K because it's set in the year like 40,000 years from now.
40,000 years from now. So it's the future. Is that what it is?
Yeah. Think high, dark, grim, dark fantasy in the future.
Okay. Does
Kind
it have
of
to be dark?
It's super dark. Yeah, lots of killing, lots of aliens, lots of.
Okay.
It's kind of like a lot of the lore is based on the Roman Empire.
Ah.
Like, and you throw in some like Judas and Jesus backstabbing
Okay.
there too.
Cool. So is this where the meme of guys being more interested in the Roman Empire than sex? Is that where that's coming from?
I don't know how to answer this diplomatically.
I think it's related, probably.
But we're gonna put all, I mean, I don't know about sex, but we're gonna put the Roman Empire in anything. That's what got
Yeah, right.
yeah.
There you go.
The people on YouTube talking a lot about the law, especially because the law is kind of written by many authors and it's directed by a company. So then there's like debates on whether the law is actually evolving in a correct way. So it's like an ongoing fiction that is being written, and people have critiques and opinions about whether it's going in the right direction. And yeah, it's really fun. People
So
are very
it's fanfic. It's fanfic then? Is it actually derived over some copyrighted material somewhere?
yeah. There's fanfic, but a lot of fan analysis
Okay.
about how the law is being written to this day.
Yeah.
And there's like fanfics written about it too. Yeah.
I see. Are you speaking out of your own experience, or are you part of this group?
I'm an enjoyer. I'm a connoisseur of this. I buy some books sometimes.
Uh-huh.
And I used to paint these miniatures when I was younger
I see.
and battle them.
Okay.
Very cool.
Let's go 40K lore.
It's
Yeah,
a
there's
bit,
there's some links in the chat people are posting too.
Okay. Wow. Okay, great. I love that. That's fantastic.
I didn't
Thank
expect
you.
it to be tonight, but yeah, thanks.
Some other answers. I put in like digital nomad scenes, especially in Bali and Chiang Mai, seem underappreciated.
So tell me more about that. Who is that, you or someone else?
Yeah, that's me.
So what's
so I've spent
underappreciated about the digital nomad scene?
So when I was spending time in places like Bali and Chiang Mai in 2017, like everything, the future, what we're experiencing now, things like remote work, working independently, working on a variety of projects, actually liking your life, not suffering through work, it all seemed obvious and normal. And that was sort of like a culture shock for me in a positive way. And these communities are still really interesting. And I was just recently in Bali, and there's a whole market now of real estate things around people that have these more fragmented work lives, like co-living, co-work, pools, saunas, hangouts with like daycare in them. And it's like, oh, there's a market for this sort of like seasonal worker. But in the US, like they're sort of missing this because we're still built around the factory schedule.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the interesting thing for me. And I sort of just think work's going to continue to be moving in this direction, but slowly.
And yeah, I'm headed to Chiang Mai in 2 weeks. Is most of the stuff in Bali happening around Ubud, or is it throughout the island right now?
Ubud, Canggu, increasingly Uluwatu, and areas north of Canggu too. Like it keeps spreading north. But yeah, if you go to these like co-working places, they're like palaces now, and they have like everything. They're all in one. It's pretty wild.
And is it still? Are you finding people living there for longer periods of time? Is not as transient as it was, or is it still just a month here, a month there, and people are actually nomads? I mean, I'm wondering if like, is the nomad part important, or is that kind of remote thing the more important part of this subculture?
So I think the remote work is the most important part. I think what's happened is it's gone from nomads, like moving around a lot, to slow mads, and actually people investing in new environments.
That's great.
And I know a lot of people with young kids now who are doing this, and there's a group called the Traveling Village, and they're doing like 25 families with kids, and it just still
they're all moving together. They relocate as a tribe.
Yeah, for 3 months.
Wow.
For 4 months. I just put this in the chat, and
Okay.
so I mean, it just still seems to be growing. Whereas like a lot of people are like, digital nomad movement's over. But yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Oh, that's great. So maybe another question is, I'm really interested in how I'm interested in heresies. I like to collect heresies, and heresies I defined as it's something that you believe that the people that you most admire don't believe. Okay, so it's not just like you think that something that maybe the mainstream doesn't believe. That's not a heresy. A heresy is something that you believe that the people that you most admire think is crazy. And so I'm interested in anybody's heresy. Does someone have a heresy that they're willing to share?
I think you came to the right community. There might need to be a part 2 around heresies.
I'm not sure
Again,
how.
so like here it would be like something that you believe that probably everybody here would not believe. Okay.
I'm not sure how heretical this is, but I think I admire a lot of technologists, and I'm kind of embedded within a lot of these communities.
Mhm.
But I guess what I disagree with a lot of technologists on is I think some like human limitations are actually good and necessary to preserve. And I think, well, I get maybe now that I'm saying, I'm like, I feel like we might all agree, but I feel like there's kind of this like utopian vision where it's like technology will free us from our limitations and we will be like these invincible cyborg figures. And I sometimes feel like we need to suffer and face challenges. Otherwise, I don't think we're going to be like full human beings in a way.
Well,
So
what are some of the limitations that you think we should retain? Like
Mhm.
death?
I think so. That
Okay. You're not for immortality. Okay. You think
Yeah.
immortality would be a bad idea?
What are your thoughts?
I'm interested in you guys' heresies. I've got my list, but I want to hear your heresies.
Yeah, I think immortality, maybe that doesn't make me very optimistic. I'm not sure if we would use it very well. And I feel like there's something about being like we have a finite amount of time on this earth that makes us like have the sense of like
Mhm.
urgency to care.
Yeah.
So who knows?
Okay. Anyone else have a heresy that they think that they believe that they think this group probably would reject?
I think I have one, and
Okay.
I'm sure that people here might not fully agree because even I don't agree with myself on this. I have 2 opinions on all important questions in life, which I think is fair. So my heresy is, I think laziness is the best human quality and is kind of counterintuitively, it is what keeps the world relatively sane. People are incredibly lazy, and that's great. I'm saying this on like my other half of my brain is like with a hammer. Like, oh, don't say that. Like we would have a revolution, everybody would get divorced all the time. We would have no social stability whatsoever if people were not as insanely lazy as we are. I think they are only hardworking because they revolt against their own laziness. And the things in this life are built by people who cannot tolerate their own laziness. It's not that they are not lazy. And I just feel, maybe this is an Eastern European thing of me, but I feel this enormous gravitational pull into doing absolutely nothing, and how much you can counter that and in what way and what social pull you will find for yourself for temporarily take off will kind of determine your life. But we are insanely lazy, and that's good.
Okay, I'm sure. Yeah, that does seem like pretty heretical.
Agree. Like use your Zoom. Sorry about those who will watch this afterwards, but hands up with your little hand in a Zoom if you agree with this statement, or if you have a part of you that agrees.
Because most people don't, so that's good. That's a good heresy then. This is one we're trying to have. You want people not to agree with you.
Yeah.
So actually, I was just reading through this thing. So Haider, you're saying that you actually the Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini was someone that influenced you. That and Ayn Rand. Okay, that combination. Tell me about that.
Some power combo over there.
Yes, they were actually polar opposites, because Ayatollah Khomeini teaches like the self is bad, individualism is evil, like death to America, you know. But then, and this, I was influenced by it while at university, and then my cousin, who was living in Toronto at the time, was reading Ayn Rand, and he was influenced by Ayn Rand. So he introduced me to like the virtue of selfishness. I'm like, no, like Ayn Rand is the Antichrist. Like she's evil. But then when I read into like her justification of reason, the importance of capitalism, what does the Enlightenment mean, classical liberalism, those sorts of ideas, I realized actually I think at the foundation, like fundamentally, human beings need to respect their agency. Like you need to respect your own capacity to think for yourself, and then base all your beliefs on this. And there are actually elements within Islam that support this. Like, and I believe like even in Christianity and Judaism, like there's this responsibility to form your own convictions. Which is something I feel not many religious people actually value as much. Like, but I think this is core to like being human.
Yeah, that's a great. So it's, one is total selfishness. The other one is total selflessness, and
yes.
So those two, yeah, that's great. Well, did anyone else have I don't want to. Did anyone else have a heresy? Maybe the last question for me. That they're willing to share with the group that would disagree with them?
Could I share something?
Please.
I think I know that there are already some agreeers in the room, but I wrote in the chat, not knowing, because you asked initially about people we admire, and I think many people I admire are also in the public spotlight. And there's a thing where you always have to have something to say, or you have to know something. And I think, well, this kills the question a bit, but I truly admire those who say, I don't know, and to leave space for things to come in, and to say, I don't know, frequently and aggressively.
Yeah, I think that's true. I suspect most people probably agree with that, though, right?
Who agrees? Who would agree? Raise your hand. Okay, I'm not a heretic. I'm sorry.
You gotta work on that one. Well, anyway, so I don't think I have any more questions, but thank you for playing with me. I really enjoyed that, and actually, I really enjoyed this whole session. So I'm really glad that you all showed up. Thank you for asking great questions, because answers are cheap, questions are hard. So thank you.
Amazing. You might have to host a session on heresies yourself in the future. That could be fun. Thank you so much to Kevin. Really appreciate your time here. I think a lot of us were inspired by you, so it's just very inspiring to spend a little time with you.
It was a pleasure. I'm going to plug my book one last time. I think people will enjoy it here. A great Christmas gift for someone who's young or young at heart. Thank you for your attention. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you all for coming. It's so great to see you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
This is a first collaboration between Intercept, Wayfare, and Plough magazines. I'm a huge fan of theirs, so this is a great privilege for me. And also that you are here to discuss faith and progress in a very ecumenical setting, something that is very close to my heart. Also thanks to Guy Montessori for this beautiful wedding and to be able to do a little nerding out in a library. I'm going to pass the mic to Susannah Black Roberts, who is our moderator tonight, and who will be the boss of this panel. The panel is going to be around 90 minutes. We will open the floor very shortly to include everybody in it. There's some food, some wine, and I'm always here. I'm going to be standing here, so if you have any questions, I'm at your enjoy.
And the loo is right around the corner there, in case anyone hasn't figured that out.
There's a loo, and it's like in the Rococo painting. The lock is above.
Oh, I didn't realize that. I just winged it.
Open the door for Maria downstairs.
Oh,
should I? Mic or no mic?
It's okay. Gotcha.
Okay, great. Okay, so as Anna said, we are doing 90 minutes total, of which kind of maybe half-ish is a conversation among our panelists, and like then half is you guys talking. If you have a question in the middle of them talking, you can raise your hand and maybe I'll call on you, but probably you should just wait. Probably. We are going to have a conversation about faith and progress. We're going to find overlaps and disagreements. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty. And our sponsors today are Wayfare magazine, of which Zach here is the editor-in-chief. It is a magazine of faith and letters from a Mormon perspective. Plough, of which I am a senior editor, is a magazine of faith and letters from an Anabaptist perspective, but it sort of tends to be more merely Christian, ecumenical. Interintellect is on a mission to create the most interesting conversations online and offline in a spirit of openness, friendship, and unity. They've been doing this for 6 years or so now, and I just feel like Anna has kind of launched herself into my awareness, at least, like a rocket, and I'm so excited for what these guys are doing. They don't do a lot of religiously themed events, but that is beginning to change. It also is a Discord to which you are invited, but I don't belong to it, and I only just found out about it right now, so I'm going to be joining. You should all join. Anna will tell us how to do that later on. Let's see. The way this started was that Zach was having a very special birthday. And he called up a bunch of his friends and said, for my birthday, I want to have a symposium. And we said, okay. So now let me introduce our speakers. Zach Davis is executive director of Faith Matters and editor of Wayfare. He is also the founder of Lyceum, an educational audio studio, and the host of Ministry of Ideas Writ Large, Illuminations and Making Meaning. Joey Keegin is editor at The Point. He is a graduate student in philosophy at Tulane. He writes for Plough, The Point, and many other places. Tara Isabella Burton is the author of novels and nonfiction books, most recently Here in Avalon and Self-Made, and writes many places, including Plough, and with her husband writes a Substack called Line of Beauty. Murtaza Hussain is a writer on culture and politics. His Substack is his name, mazmhussain.substack.com. And I am Susannah Black Roberts, senior editor at Plough and at Mere Orthodoxy, also writing many places. And my Substack with my husband is at argosy.substack.com. We also all probably podcast, which is unfortunate. We are also, I'm really sorry to tell you, all on Twitter. And on April 13th, you can catch many of us again, also in New York, at another Intellect event, here in this room, on a much larger event, actually, that goes from like 2:30 in the afternoon until whenever, on the future of publishing. Joey, Tara, Maz, and Zach, 5 minutes or less each. This is a conversation about faith and progress. So to begin with, if during your initial words, you can let the audience know, among other things, what your religious commitments are, that would be a cool place to start. My thought is that the idea of progress is linked in most religious traditions with what is called eschatology. And I'm kind of interested, one thing to talk about at some point during this evening is like how all of you think about your own hopes for the progress of whatever society, America, whatever, how that links up with sort of metaphysical expectations. But also, whatever else you want to talk about, Joey, why don't you go first?
So somebody says, please, Zach, I think Zach.
Zach is going last. Zach had said he wanted to go last.
I'm going last. You go first.
Tara goes.
Take us away. Take us away.
All right. Hi, I'm Tara. I am religious convinced. I am Christian. I'm Episcopalian. I'm slightly Anglo-Catholic. I don't know how specific we want to get here.
However specific you want to be.
And I guess I am curious. So I think there's two ways of approaching the question of progress. And one is, as you say, eschatologically. That is human history, the history of our society, whatever our means in the sentence, sort of tending towards a particular end or a particular potentially good, potentially bad outcome? Or what should the relationship of our understanding of societal progress, used sort of colloquially, be to the question of our eschatological ends? What happens at the end of it all? And I think, increasingly suspicious, but both of the language of progress and that there can be a kind of meaningful link to the eschatological that we can know, which is to say, I think the questions of pursuing justice, pursuing goodness, pursuing a good society are perhaps best done when they're historically informed, but not part of a particular narrative of progress, if that makes sense. So to say, I think it becomes very easy when we talk using the language of progress, both to dismiss the past in a particular way, or say, things on X axis are better now than they were, and they will continue to be better, and we have learned things, and we are enlightened beings, and I think a lot of this, my suspicion of this comes from Enlightenment language of humans becoming adults in a certain way. We were once moral children, and now we've learned, and we know better. And I think my suspicion of that is not because I think we are trying to kind of recover some superior pre-Enlightenment past, say, or that I'm not saying this from a necessarily reactionary perspective at all, but rather that I think that one of the relationship of a faithful person to contemporary culture must always be one of sort of loving criticism, but where we are engaging with the world that we are in, not with some sort of fantasy of a historical narrative that sort of we're identifying ourselves as part of. And I think the best way to do that, and maybe this is, as an Episcopalian, I feel like I'm just instinctively always going to take the moderate position, that a sense of humility vis-a-vis the history more broadly. What can we learn from the past? What can we critique about it? But also, what can we learn about the present? How do we sort of engage with the world that we're in meaningfully? And I think that I'm wary that the language of progress is a good one. And I think the sort of secondary question, which is that of eschatology, is also sort of fundamentally unanswerable. We don't know how history is going to turn out. We don't know exactly what the end of days looks like from whether within or without our religious commitments. And so I think a kind of more small scale approach to the question of how do we make this society better, this world that we are in better, for whatever definition of world, our neighborhood, our street, our city, our country, our world, that these are all kind of particular political communities that we ought to be engaging with and in. But I think that the only way to do so effectively is to resist sort of grand historical narratives that moralize history as going in a particular direction. So, progress. Not sure, what is it anyway? I'll end it there.
Joey, now it's okay. Now it's your turn.
Sure. First of all, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Zach, for having me. I think I'm not as accomplished as some people on the panel. I think I was looking at their backgrounds. I'm not a philosopher or even a religious scholar. I'm kind of a layperson, but me and Zach have talked about some of these things before, so I thought maybe it'd be good to take part and share some thoughts about this. I'm Muslim. Actually, I'm fasting for Ramadan, so I haven't eaten anything since 4 a.m. last night. If I seem less lucid or say anything wrong, I'm going to blame it on that. And I'm actually going to probably break my fast on here. I'm going to have a date I'm going to eat at some point and when the sun goes down. So it's like a very immersive religious experience. And I was also very impressed that you guys have Substacks with your wives. My wife is there, so my spouses, my wife is there. I'm going to talk to her about having Substacks. That's a great idea. It's very interesting. Like said, I'm Muslim. My understanding of these subjects when I was growing up, I didn't read in any languages I had access to. And I grew up here. A lot of very convincing and compelling answers how to reconcile religion and modernity, so to speak. So a lot of my influences came from Christian writers, actually, when I was younger, and particularly, like, not that I endorsed everything they on every view or aware of all their views, but like David Bentley Hart or Edward Fesser, Ross Douthat, and Joseph Keegin. These people were really influential on me, especially the Catholic and Orthodox ones, because I was Muslim, so I was kind of a minority, and they're kind of like minority traditions within American Christianity, which is very Protestant, and Mormonism is also one of them too. So that was a really big influence on me in reconciling, and at some point I wasn't even sure if I was going to be, I remember when I was 19, I was thinking, am I even going to be religious, or am I just going to be, secular like most people I know? And then I read all these books and went on this big journey. I was like, okay, now I feel very much more solid about this. I'm not done, but I have to, now I'm more grounded as a result of that. So, I'm still kind of learning about these things in a way. Like, I don't think that learning ever stops, but I've kind of come to the sense that, okay, if I take the Islamic tradition, I think that progress, the idea of it grew very organically out of Christian teleology. Liberalism very much so as well too. So these things, to Muslim people, they came as kind of like a foreign imposition or something they came to from the outside. So there's a very famous incident in history when Napoleon arrived in Egypt and he invaded Egypt the first time in the late 18th century. And Muslim countries have been conquered before by the Mongols, the Russians, and so forth, but they didn't really bother them that much because they felt that they had a superior culture they could assimilate people to. But it was the first time in history they felt that actually something was different here because they suspected that the French culture after the Revolution, the Enlightenment, and so forth, maybe it was superior, maybe it was a better culture, and this engendered this identity crisis around ideas of progress or identity, which are still going on to this day and never really ended. My own view, and I kind of agree with Tara about some things she said as well too, is that, and I'm not to say that I'm totally sure about this, but I feel that progress is sort of very much tied to technological change, and it's almost like not a myth, but sort of like a magic trick that we feel that as long as the material environment is changing, our mastery over it is changing all the time, then therefore we're also making moral progress all the time too, which I think is not necessarily always the case. So, it's very hard to know what to say or what to do in this situation because I really enjoy a lot of the fruits of progress, so to speak, moral progress or what we think about it. But I do think that, I thought about this during the pandemic. I was like, if the lights went out for 2 months, like would we regress back 1,000 years? And if it went out for like a year, would we regress back 10,000 years morally? Hopefully it's not the case, but I do kind of think about that a lot. So when I read people like Ross Douthat and I see these very tactfully expresses these sort of doubts and concerns about the grander narrative society and progress and liberalism, kind of agree with them. Kind of think that that is kind of true. And usually when I conclude when my remarks, I have a poem. And there's a poem I was thinking about when I was thinking about this event. It's by a very famous poet from the Indian subcontinent. His name was Muhammad Iqbal. And he wrote in Persian and Urdu, and he's very famous even today in Pakistan and Iran and Turkey, and places where the Persian language is very appreciated. He had a line in this poem called Shikwa. Shikwa means complaints, and the poem's addressed to God. And there's two components to it. One, he's talking to God, complaining, and the other part of the poem, God is complaining, responding to his complaint. And the crux of his complaint is that the world's totally changed, and everything is falling apart. And Muslims, he's speaking before, they become very backwards, and they don't have. They're not leading the charge of humanity by any means anymore. And there's a line in the poem, he says, I'll say it in Persian, then I'll translate it. He says, Bani aghyar ke ab chane wale dunya, rege apne liye ek khayali dunya. What it means is the people who don't believe in God now seem to control the world and they have all the benefits of it. And we who always believe in you and always were faithful, all that's left for us is the imaginary world. And we can dream about it in our heads or think about when we die, but that's kind of what's left for us. So, when I think about it, I kind of think like progress is kind of a train, which is, we're on and we're going on it, and eventually the train will run out of gas, and then, I don't know, then we'll get off and then we'll see where we are. And that's kind of what I think about it.
Great. I'm glad I'm not the only pessimist. I sort of come in anticipating being sort of the lone skeptical voice, but I'm not. So I'm an Episcopalian, thing I came to later in life. I'm also a student of philosophy, and as a student of Socrates and a follower of Jesus, they both counsel pessimism. So at least with regard to political things, they're not especially sanguine about the prospects of pursuing all the things we would like to have in the world and actually making those things the case. So I tend to, I share a lot of these same critiques of progress, and I think that in regards to how either of these traditions, a philosophic tradition or a religious tradition, would approach the question, or at least a philosophic tradition that's not fully on board the Enlightenment train, right? Because of course this notion of progress is born out of philosophy, born out of a sort of enthusiastic modernism, a kind of post-Cartesian desire to become the masters and possessors of nature, etc. A sort of earlier, more skeptical, more Socratic philosophical tradition would regard progress as a question primarily, and one that probably does not have all that positive of an answer. So as not to cover a lot of the same ground, though, I'll say I've been teaching a fair amount of early modern philosophy lately. So I'm a graduate student, and I teach this introductory philosophy class, and I've had my students reading Bacon and Descartes, so these early thinkers of the guys who sort of made modernity happen, who sort of invented, laid the groundwork for modern science and for this big project of controlling nature for the sake of the relief of man's estate, etc. And there's a moment in Bacon's New Organon where he makes his ambitions very clear. It's section 129, if you care to look it up. And he has this really remarkable statement, and I think about this all the time when I think about this question of progress, especially with regard to technology. He says, all right, so all the great statesmen, we think that they're really wonderful. We think they've done really great things for people, but it turns out that their greatness is limited because they've only been able to benefit those people who live in their political communities, right? The states that they control have a boundary, and outside that boundary, they can't benefit those people. I, Francis Bacon, I'm interested in benefiting everybody on the planet, right? Every single human being alive. How do you do that? Through discoveries and inventions. Well, what kinds of discoveries and inventions? Well, think about things like the printing press and the magnet and gunpowder, right? These are universally beneficent, good things that have done all kinds of great stuff for everybody. And somebody might say that they have some negative consequences, but don't worry too much about those. They're really, really good. And when I read that with my students, I say, okay, so we now live 3 centuries after this comment of Bacon's, right? Is it the case that gunpowder, the printing press, and the magnet's an interesting one. He says this for use in navigation, which, if you think about it, in that particular use also has some ambiguities in it. Is he right that these are unambiguously beneficent inventions? Clearly the answer to this is no. And so I always wonder, it seems like this sort of early modern enthusiasm for technology, and this idea that technology is going to be the sort of vehicle by which we achieve an ever better and ever more comfortable sort of human life together. Bacon was a really smart guy. I don't think he was stupid, but I do think he was making a kind of bluff, right? Trust in the power of technology, trust in the power of inventions and discoveries, and we're going to reap immeasurable benefits from the storehouse of nature. Okay, so to a certain extent, that seems to have been true, right? Modern technology is really extraordinary. I think all of us have probably benefited immensely from it. So to a certain extent, we have to admit that there is some progress we can point to and say, wow, I'm sure and glad that they can put limbs back on and stuff of that nature, right? There was a time when you couldn't do such a thing. But with regard to progress in a more general sense, it seems to me like the question is still hanging open, and The notion of sort of moral progress of the Enlightenment, I'm not so sure about. Political progress, I don't really know. That also seems like something that both the philosophic and most religious traditions would have a kind of skeptical attitude towards. So, all that to say, I guess I feel ambivalent about the question generally, and we should talk more about technology in particular, because my thoughts on technology from the perspective of faith are very sketchy. I don't have an awful lot of them, but it does seem to me that there's something to be said on the question of progress. Maybe I'm being a gentle progress defender now against the skepticism, because I had to sort of stake out a different position. There's something to be said about if your faith counsels mercy. Well, maybe the development of medical technology is one possible way of achieving this kind of thing, of mercy and charity. But again, it doesn't seem so clear. So I just throw that out as a possible question.
I would just like to say that Matt Sitman, who's a friend of many of us here, when I tweeted the subject of this, he said, "Is anyone on that panel going to say anything good about progress?" So really, Zach, it's kind of up to you at this point.
I said something good
you
about
said something good about progress. Okay.
Maybe
Despite
one
myself.
cheer.
Yeah.
First off, thank you all for being here. This really is just a joy, and I'm honored by your presence, and thank you, fellow panelists, and Anna for making this happen. Nobody seems that happy. Nobody appears to be invigorated with purpose, vision, creativity, or abundant life. Instead of moving forward in confidence, our culture, our civilization seems stagnant, exhausted, and full of doubt. What is wrong? Many things are wrong. Declining birth rates, historical guilt, an economy premised on scarcity and precarity, dehumanizing technologies, hyper-individualism, the death of God, and there are many others. But I want to focus my initial reflections tonight on how the way we think about the shape of history can affect, for good or ill, our sense of individual and social flourishing in time. The shape of history. Many early civilizations, like the Egyptians, Babylonians, or Greeks, believed that history happened in cycles, like the rising and setting of the sun, or the regular passing of the seasons. Nations would naturally undergo periods of birth, flowering, decay, death, and then rebirth. There wasn't much one could do to alter these cycles. They followed a cosmic order, a natural rhythm. And there wasn't really a purpose to history. At best, it was a playground for capricious gods. A different view of history began to develop in Jewish and Christian thought. For the writers of the Bible, history was not a series of unconnected events, but the vehicle by which a loving God realized his purposes for humanity. The creation, the resurrection of Jesus, and the last judgment gave history not only a beginning and an end, but a direction. Time was no longer a meaningless loop. It had become an arrow speeding towards a divine destiny. Deep purpose was found in understanding the arc of that arrow and aligning oneself with its movement. That began to change during the Enlightenment, Tara. Instead of God directing history, thinkers like Voltaire and Kant began giving a starring role to human reason. The purpose of history became less about preparing humanity for a paradise in heaven and more about achieving progress here on earth. Still an arrow moving forward, but flung forward by purely human hands. Enlightenment visions of progress have focused on values such as freedom, equality, reason, and mastery over nature. All wonderful gifts. But as the Romantics recognized, such gifts aren't enough to fill the human heart. I think the ennui and malaise that so many people feel today is because ordering a society around an entirely Enlightenment vision of progress is inadequate for creating conditions of deeper joy and flourishing. The Enlightenment vision also overly equates progress with newness. Ross Douthat's book, The Decadent Society, is a brilliant synthesis and diagnosis of decadence, convincingly pointing out that our fashion, movies, technologies, and political debates really haven't changed that much since the 1970s. He really, really wants a good new movie that is not a sequel. But I found myself wondering, why is Ross Douthat, a committed Christian, so hungry for newness? Why is novelty or change itself assumed to be a sign that a given culture is on the right track? Aren't Christians seeking not newness, but to faithfully live an ancient revelation? That witness will, of course, look a little different depending on the time and culture a Christian is living. But expressing newness for its own sake isn't, in my view, really the main purpose of a Christian life. Rather, it is to continually breathe fresh, immanent life into eternal, transcendent forms. To create a harmony between material embodied reality and immaterial ideals. In other words, the best view of history is neither a circle nor an arrow, but a combination of the two, a spiral. Let me give an example from my own faith tradition of how this might look in practice. Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, was born in 1805 in upstate New York and grew up amid the spiritual ferment of the Second Great Awakening. He prayed to know what was true and was visited in a small forest clearing by two beings, God the Father and Jesus Christ, who called him to restore the lost truths of the early church. Many other Christian movements at the time felt a similar desire to recover or restore so-called primitive Christianity, to remove all the accumulations and get back to the simple purity of New Testament Christianity. But Joseph Smith's understanding of restoration turned out to be quite different and more radical, and I think fascinating and instructive even for non-LDS people. Joseph Smith did begin with some restoring work you might expect. He brought back primitive church offices like apostles, teachers, and deacons. He sought and manifested gifts of the Spirit, like speaking of tongues, angelic ministrations, etc. But then it gets really weird. He restored the idea of God speaking again now, in our time, both by bringing forth the Book of Mormon, a set of scriptures, and also by receiving new revelations directly from God. There are hundreds of "Thus saith the Lord" revelations and proclamations that Joseph received. But it gets even weirder still. He brings back temple worship, something that Jews themselves had abandoned in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. He created new priesthood powers, one named after the mysterious biblical figure Melchizedek. And most infamously, Joseph brings back patriarchal polygamy until the United States military snuffed it out of Utah, mostly. All of Joseph's theological work, in my view, was spiral-like. It was a creative, dynamic recycling of inherited forms to create genuinely new, vital combinations. It linked old and new together in a sacred harmony. Now, even though Brigham Young's sexual lifestyle is now celebrated in New York Magazine, I'm not suggesting you all become Mormons, but rather that there is probably a reason why most observers point to Utah as being the least decadent place in the Western Hemisphere. It is a spiral culture, a people grounded by the circle and invigorated by the arrow.
So with that, I'm going to open up to you guys to a conversation amongst yourselves, and then we're going to go to you guys. So I guess one thing to ask would be, Joey, do you want to respond to Zach's vision of, like, what would your pushback be if you had a pushback?
Remember, it's my birthday, Joey.
It's your birthday. The attention to this idea of the shape of history, I think, is a really good place to go. That much of the time history is invoked as if it were like an obvious thing, right? That it's obviously a linear progress of, you know, the actions of human beings, individual and collective, that's heading somewhere, maybe we either know or we don't know, but nonetheless this is the shape of it. But I think you're exactly right that there are different shapes that the idea of history might take in our minds. I mean, one of the great diagnoses of this is Nietzsche's Use and Abuse of History for Life. If you haven't read it, highly recommended. He questions these very notions of the ways that we think about history. I think it's a very useful sort of way of approaching the question. I think that this spiral, that sort of model that you propose is really interesting, of constantly reinvigorating the present with reference to the past. That seems like a good way of doing about things, but I guess the question would be, in a place like the United States, right? We have an enormous amount of possible pasts to draw from, right? A whole bunch of different people from a whole bunch of different kinds of places, with a whole bunch of different senses of what the ancestral is that you might tap into for the sake of the present. And maybe this idea is one that can only, right? And we're talking to a certain extent about, well, what are the relationships between concrete, small-scale communities and then what's happening at the level of the whole? Maybe this kind of idea of rethinking of the shape of history, of trying to sort of develop a more dynamic relationship between the past and the present, can only happen on the small scale with a handful of people who more or less share a worldview. That even is still probably pretty difficult in a place like America. We're a very contentious society. There's a lot of disagreement over what that old thing is, and how exactly to understand it and how exactly to make it new, as Ezra Pound says, to take that old thing and use it for life today. So I don't know. It sounds good, but I see difficulties, and I wonder, maybe we can talk a little bit about how what some of those difficulties are, or how we might overcome them.
Maz, I'm wondering, so to what degree, this is just my curiosity, so Islam is an Abrahamic religion, but you'd referred to the sort of idea of an era of history as being more of a Jewish than a Christian idea. Mm-hmm. But there is a sense of that, I mean, Islam is not a pagan sort of cyclical religion. So isn't there still that vision of an era of history in Islam?
There is, yeah. There's not the idea of cyclical history, which you might find more in pagan religions, or even Hinduism would have as well too. I think that it's interesting because obviously this idea of progress, I said it emerged organically out of Christianity, but I think that a lot of the developments I'm referring to were actually post-Enlightenment, mm-hmm. in the sense of the perfectibility of the world and novelty and change of the world and so forth. I think that, I don't want to be like a curmudgeon or ungrateful in the sense that I'm sitting in this nice air-conditioned room, I took a train here, and I'm like lambasting material progress, and like, I don't want to say that. It's just that I do think that the important thing of that any form of progress should be embedded with some sort of baseline. Like, well, let's say you want to make sure that it's always, you have like God or Jesus Christ is like the lodestar that you're embedding any form of progress around, because when it becomes unmoored from that, human beings just seem to sort of embrace worship of the self, and then all the material progress becomes further mustered towards that end. And personally, I don't think that I'm worthy of being worshipped. Knowing myself very well, I wouldn't want to do that, and I think that everyone is kind of like that to some degree. So, in the Islamic tradition, I think that I would say, and I'm not like, I can't say a definitive answer about this, but I think that their understandings, they're doing like catch up in a way, because of the fact the Enlightenment happened in Europe first, all the grappling with it. I will say that in Muslim countries, they consume Western modernity on 50-year time delay, basically. Mm-hmm. So even down to material styles, like the way cities are developed and the way philosophical debates happening, I think that that's the case now. So I tend to look, not because I think the ideas are only inherent to Christianity or Judaism, but I just tend to look there first. I have in the past, because I found the cutting edge ideas for grappling with these questions are from those thinkers. I think it's changing now a little bit, actually. I think there are some catching up, especially in Western countries. But yeah, I think that because Islam is sort of like, it's in the trifecta of religions, and it came to the last one that came, the third one, And especially now, given the socio-political situation, I tend to think, it's not that it doesn't have those ideas in it. It's just that I'm not looking there first all the time, or having been in the past at least, for answering these questions.
Yeah. Tara, do you want to?
Yes, I want to push back gently on Zach on something, because I am actually, in pushing back on you, want to push back on myself, which is to say, I think that I am, like many of us here, maybe all of us, sort of instinctively wary of the idea of progress, moral, historical, technological, as being an unallied good. I do see, among other things, a sort of strand of decline, or what I would consider moral decline, that does worry me, in terms of what I see as the shift, this profound shift, post-Enlightenment, sure, let's say, to kind of contextualize it, between a vision of the good as something that is ordered to something outside us, to God, or to kind of a sense of the transcendent, to, roughly speaking, a degree of self-worship, the idea that our desires, our kind of what we want internally, is the closest conduit we have to the good. I wrote a whole book about this. That said, one of the things I want to avoid in this conversation is the idea that there is a kind of unique moral evil in the present day. And you were kind of reading us an extremely, I think, accurate and bleak vision of where we are historically. But I don't know that there has ever been a historical era where things were good. I wonder if it's like the opening of Anna Karenina. All historical eras are unhappy in their own way. And I'm not sure, even as I spent a lot of time like decrying the modern world, I'm very glad to have penicillin. And I'm very glad that I'm not living in a time where people are murdering each other over religion. Sorry, let me rephrase that. I was thinking, I'm glad that I'm not living during the 16th century wars of religion, and that sort of in the Western world is not, it's not happening right now in New York City, and I'm glad of it. There we go. But what I want to say there is that how can we talk meaningfully about, and I think one of the things as a Christian, I have a theological anthropology of the human condition, what it means to be human, what it means to be fallen, that is not historically grounded. It is, we, as human beings, we are sort of so enthralled to sin that we will mess up the good things. We get technology, we use it we get the printing press, we use it to disseminate hatred. We get gunpowder. I mean, I'm not sure there's a good version of gunpowder, but we fuck fireworks, yeah, and we fuck that up too. And so I'm curious about a way of thinking. Is there a way that we can think meaningfully about the ills of our contemporary era without kind of fetishizing the grand narrative of decline? And I think that particularly from a Christian perspective, that's all the more important, precisely because I think there is a narrative that is true in Christianity, and that is God became man and God came back, and that narrative grounds us in a way that kind of I think is a constant reminder to reject aesthetic narratives, either of progress or of decline and return. And I think both of those are kind of instinctively sort of lend themselves, or we have those narratives when we want to tell a sexy story about history and our sexy, unique, special place in it, either because we are the winners, we are at the smartest, best time that has ever been, or we are, singularly cursed to be living in the most sort of godless of times. And I don't think either of those is true. At the same time, I think that it's sort of the eschatology of Christianity, I think, is the most important thing kind of already happened. Like we have, Jesus dies, Jesus comes back. In the certain sense, it's over, and the sort of aesthetic meaningfulness of history can only be accessed from a degree of kind of sacrificing our own interestingness. Which is to say, I am a sort of progress skeptic up to a point, although again, if offered, I probably would stay where I am in 2024. But is there is there a way of analyzing the ills of the time without resorting to a narrative either of decline or of progress? We haven't fixed it enough, or things were good until those pesky Enlightenment philosophes ruined everything. And is there a useful way of engaging with historical and cultural and ideological change that sort of allows us to sort of hold fast to what is good, even as we kind of engage in critique and even condemnation of what we see as societal ills? And is there a way of doing so that is humble enough to leave open the possibility that we are completely wrong, and that there will be generations who see far better than we do, or we may be found wanting by future generations, correctly or incorrectly, because we have no control over that. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder about how do we sort of how do we make the world better as best we can without falling into the sort of aesthetic grand narratives either of progress or regress?
Yeah. I totally agree with Tara. And I actually, that was a kind of an interesting way to put it. I kind of, the idea that like the most important thing has already happened, which is that Jesus died and then did not stay dead. I think that's true, but that it also is like, so how do you then bring that into the present, and what are we hoping for in the future? And that is a kind of like, one answer is the Mormon answer, which is like this idea of continuing revelation. The other would be a sort of like Protestant or Catholic answer, which would be something more like, we're hoping for a second coming, and meanwhile, that bringing that spiraling is about sort of taking communion and returning to like the origin moment, the sacrificial moment through the Eucharist, and through our acts of service to each other. And like figuring out which is the right way to spiral is kind of important. But why don't we now open that up to questions from the audience, from Santi?
I have a question for Birthday Boy and for Murtaza, because there's part of me that envies you guys, because you're part of faith traditions that are actually growing in the secular West. But my question is, well, I'm a Catholic, so we used to run things in the West, and then the secular Enlightenment came, as Murtaza pointed out, and we tried two different strategies. In the late 19th century, we attacked progress, and people haven't thanked us enough for that. And then in Vatican II, we maybe embraced it too much, but don't tell Matt Sidman and Matt Boudway that. But eventually, though, there is a sort of tension between the secular Enlightenment and the Catholic Church that has not been fully resolved, and the church is in such a bad state that it's almost a moot point. But eventually, the Mormons and the Muslims in the West, obviously Islam has many other countries where it's the dominant religion, and Mormonism is spreading in South America a lot. But in the secular West, you guys will grow and grow and grow, and eventually you'll hit that point where the tension will be a lot more felt. And what's an enlightened Western Islam 100 years from now look like? And what does an enlightened Western Mormonism look like 100 years from now?
I mean, my first answer is I do think we're in somewhat of a post-truth environment, or at least there's a lot less general trust of reason to access truth in a way that is extremely threatening to religion. So 10 years ago, all the people that I knew that were leaving Mormonism were like, I looked on the internet, Book of Mormon's not true. Now they leave for like much more emotional reasons, like I don't feel like I belong. The truth, it's almost like, well, who knows what's true? So it's possible that the fragmented epistemological authority that the internet creates makes some of the crisis different a little bit. However, you don't need to wait 100 years, Santi. Like, Mormonism is struggling right now to keep its young in a severe way because, yeah, internet just is acid on faith, acid on commitment.
No, I was thinking the opposite. I thought Mormonism is going to take over America.
No, that's Amish. Yeah.
No internet. No internet.
Yeah, you can't have phones. You can't have
Is there going to be a
phones.
creative engagement, like when Greek philosophy re-entered the West, the Catholics didn't just capitulate. There was a synthesis.
I mean, there's Wayfare. We'll see.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that 100 years from now, whatever enlightened Western Islam looks like, it has to look very American or very British or very German or French or whatever. Because obviously Islam is a globalized religion, but when you go to Turkey, people don't think of it as an Arab religion, think of it as a Turkish religion. Or they go to India, think of it as Indian religion, or Africa, think of it as African religion. They don't see it as foreign. So it has to take on, it's like, the analogy people use is you pour water into a vase and it takes the shape of the vase, and the water is still there, but then it has to be in a cultural form and a style that is palatable and makes sense in the history and traditions of that place. And it's because it's not ethnically specific, it should be able to do that. But I actually agree with Zachary in the sense that everyone seems to think their own traditions in crisis, because everyone, Muslims, like, yeah, it's a huge crisis, and everyone's like Muslim in the future, so they don't really have a great sense of confidence and the belief that the future is theirs. I don't really perceive that. They think that there's a lot of big problems, particularly because Muslim young people, they grow up here, they're susceptible to the same social pressures and the same. Like I mentioned when I was younger, I had these big doubts. Like every kid, I think, has those doubts, regardless of their parents' beliefs, their backgrounds. So I think that I don't really will Muslims be recognizably the same they are in the United States, whatever exists 100 years from now. I don't know. Maybe it will, maybe it's not, maybe it won't. But yeah, I don't know. I would think that if it were to, it would have to be through institutions which somehow make it fit into the prevailing norms of society that exist. I think the interesting thing, the complicated thing in the United States is because all the assimilatory pressures which usually exist in the United States, have sort of dissipated a lot. It's become a lot weaker in the sense. So when people say it has to be a very American, was there consensus what that means anymore? No one really knows what that means. What's the aesthetic that represents anymore? I don't know. And I think a lot of young kids today, I see in recent events in context of it, they see Islam as like a countercultural religion, or somehow it's like it's a religion of third worldism or something like that, or some mix of leftism with religions. This is the religion of that. That's really not the case, actually. It's not really, I don't view it, just looking at it just rationally and examining history, it's not accurate. But if that's what makes sense to people, maybe it'll take some sort of color like that. There's actually a quote by René Girard, the French philosopher. He said something after 9/11. He said that Islam is the voice of the voice of the frustrated masses in their mimetic rivalry with the West, and that's just Islam is the word we ascribe to that, actually. So he's not talking about the religion itself, which is something very conservative, differently, but something which is being adapted to political circumstances. So I think maybe it'll become like that. It'll become a voice of political protest, and sometimes good, sometimes bad. But I wouldn't like that, actually. I think that'd be a very great failing, because the purpose of it is actually to maintain a connection with God. And you maintain a connection with God, the good social benefits should flow naturally down from that. And it could be very conservatively American. It could be Midwestern aesthetic, it's totally fine. It could be Southern, it's completely fine. But I think that as long as God is the center of it, that's the most important thing. If something else becomes the center of it, then I don't think that whatever comes out later will be good, because it starts from the wrong premise.
Ian.
So I'm just finishing reading this book called The Time to Keep Silence by Patrick Leigh-Fermor, which is lovely. So it's basically this travel journalist who goes to a series of monasteries. He hates it at first every time. He's like, these people look like death. This place is full of death. And then within a couple of weeks, he's like, this is magical. This is, he's immersed in this deep contemplative joy. And so one of the stories he tells of each monastery is it's long history of 1,000 years or whatever. And it's sort of like the scene in Monty Python where the king's like, well, I built one castle in the swamp and it sank into the swamp, and I built another one, that one sank too. And the stories of these monasteries are like that. They're cyclical. They're like, well, one king came and knocked it down, right? And then 45 years later, 3 monks came and they started tilling the soil, and then within 100 years there were 100 monks, and like then that one was destroyed and they came back again, and you know, they end up building in each case these like incredibly deep and beautiful traditions, this beautiful craft work, like this beautiful life. But it seems like that kind of work has a kind of timelessness to it, right? To dig in with 3 monks and just start having a monastery until it becomes beautiful 100 years later, like it's hard for me to imagine in that cycle of building and destroying, monks thinking either about forward or back, right? Like it seems like there has to be a sort of total immersion in the present, in this building that you're doing in the present, that maybe is uniquely facilitated by a religious vision, I think probably. But I wonder, you know, are we quite certain that thinking in terms of progress and regress or the sort of operative and useful terms?
That's a great question. And I'm going to answer because I can. And then Tara can. But I feel like I think it's a particular way of thinking about like the New Jerusalem or the world to come in Christianity that I think allows that to happen, which is that like you're not actually banking on succeeding. Certainly not in your own lifetime, possibly ever, depending on your eschatology, but like what you are banking on is like what you're building is not going to be lost. So if you build a beautiful, clerestory or whatever, or if you make a stained glass window, or if you illuminate a manuscript, or if you publish a gorgeous magazine, they all might like go into the landfill, but that thing will, in some actually fairly material and weird sense, not be lost. And so I think that is what allows that kind of patient, we can sort of leave we are aiming at something permanent, like not just long term, not like 1,000 years, but like permanent. And so we don't have to like make sure that the 1,000 years happens because the millennium is going to happen. So God's going to take care of the 1,000 years. I don't know. That was just. But were you gonna?
I just wanted to add something that you actually inspired it or reminded me of, Susannah, when we were talking earlier, which is I think liturgical time is one of the sort of weird things about Christian theology, but also about the sort of relationship between history, linear history, cyclical history, and the fact that participation in liturgy is especially like the more sort of liturgically robust tradition you're in, the better. The more I think that this is palpable, which is, and I think the sort of example of the monastic example is a really useful one here. You are in the present, but there are certain ways that we participate in not just in the past, in the moment of Christ's death, but also in a kind of a present that is not a sort of horizontal present. That is the sort of the presence of all believers, say, or the present, and I think that return, which is neither exactly cyclical, because I think I really like the spiral analogy, that simultaneously history is moving forward. There is an eschatological end. We are not just sort of returning always to death and a particular historical death and particular historical resurrection, and yet we do not only exist in the present. And I think that is a sort of, it is a mystery of the Christian faith, of my Christian faith, certainly. It's absolutely a mystery to me. But I think that it does invite a perspective that is simultaneously present. We are, and so such that we can only participate, our only political work can be, it can be sort of ideal for the future in the sense that we are trying to do a good thing to leave a better world for those behind us, and yet it has to be about sort of pursuing true things, good things, mediated through the like limited understanding we have in a particular place, in a particular time, knowing that sometimes that means like, this particular fire is what we have to put out right now, or this is a particular way in which justice needs to be enacted here and now. But ultimately, that the sort of the sense of engaging with the present as present rests upon a faith, really, that we have some kind of access to a vision of something that helps us to understand what the New Jerusalem might kind of look like, which is perhaps a bit of a hedgy way of saying it, but I think that kind of constant interplay between the complication of being embodied in a place and a time, and also that particular place and time being part of another presence that is always available to us to orient us, allows for that sort of twofold movement. And this is certainly, like, I don't want to risk saying, like, here are some cool metaphors in Christianity and that's why it's pragmatically true. No, like, I really believe this literally is true. But I think that there is this sort of, the whole God became man thing does sort of require us always to be so conscious of, there's an eternal out there, and there is something kind of specific and material and present here. And like, whenever I find myself veering too much off in one or the other direction, it is precisely that duality that, like, moves me back to the center, because, again, Episcopalian.
Professor Lilla. Yes.
Oh, hi. Following on Tara's remarks, I have the feeling here that it might be a good time to start making some distinctions that would help guide the conversation. And the first distinction that hasn't been made and was glossed over or denied, I can't tell, is that there's something called the Judeo-Christian theory of time. The Jewish tradition, the Christian traditions are completely different. And they are both messianic, and in Judaism, messianism comes in very late, right? But essentially, the Jewish picture of time is that there's a covenant between God and man, and time rolls along, and human beings depart from the covenant. God is disappointed. He either lets them suffer for a while because of their departure, or helps them up, or punishes them, and then order is restored. There is no sense that tomorrow has, the significance of tomorrow depends on the significance of today, or the reverse. So time doesn't matter in this vision until the Messiah comes, and he'll come when he comes. And to desire to hasten the arrival of the Messiah is a great sin. Christian time, on the other hand, is broken time for the reasons Tara was talking about. Hegel called the incarnation the turning point of history. And so Christian time is broken before the ante-Christian period and the post-Christian period. And the theological problem has always been how to connect those two, or not, or make sense of that. Either the pagan period was just darkness and randomness, or it was a preparation for the gospel, as Eusebius wrote about, right? But once you break time, and in a way, what happens is, for the individual Christian life and for Christendom, is that life from that moment on has a mission, it has a telos, it has, so action, two things happen. One, you know where to orient yourself and orient your action because you're moving towards something. And you know where you are to understand your condition, right? So there's a far greater distinction between the Jewish and Christian conceptions of historical time than there is between the Christian and the Enlightenment one, where the differences are comparatively minor. It's just the absence of God. And so Christian, so much of what you may want to blame modernity for in its theory of progress is owing to Christianity. If you compare theories of history and cultures worldwide over time. And so the first question to ask yourself for anyone who is a believer is, does time matter or not? Do I need to have a sense of the time in which I'm living, not just that these are dark times, bright times, in order somehow to know where I am and to orient my action. And so Augustine was sort of split about this, right? And the church was ever since. So after the fall of Rome, he tells Christians in the city of God, time doesn't matter. God's taking care of that. What matters is our relationship, right? But on the side, he tells his disciple Orosius, while you're at it, please write a providential history, right? So we're covering both bases. So there's always been that tension in Christianity. And what gets lost, I think, in the modern period is the way Christians or people of faith understand themselves. Is that it's harder for them to see that there's another option, which I think was, again, knocking around in what Tara said. And that is to say that eschatology has nothing to do with time. It has to do with a way of orienting yourself in relation to an event that's happened, mainly, but also an event that will happen. And so, you know, it seems like a time perhaps to go back and read Karl Barth, especially, who, you know, emphasizes, you know, his great battle against the German Christians was to say, do not invest yourself in time. The relationship between the created world and God is that they touch like a tangent to a circle and it leaves a crater, and that's all to be said, right? So I think some of these distinctions between orientation and action, whether time matters or not, in terms of eschatology, might help orient some of these discussions.
I think that's a good point, and I also think that one set of ideas that might help with that is that, like, what a huge thing that Barth was rejecting, at least as I understand it, was the post-millennial understanding of eschatology. So, like, Barth was saying, actually things are not, he was kind of anti-social gospel in a way, but he was also anti-social gospel of the right, which was kind of Nazism. And so he was, or the Nazi version of Christianity. So he was saying, like, you can't say that things are getting better either in a liberal or conservative way and that that's God's will. Because he saw what happened when people did that in, you know, in the conservative way, and people, you know, it's maybe a little bit less scary when people do that in a liberal way, but, you know, if you took Marx to be doing that in a liberal kind of Christian heretical way, that would be equally scary.
Right, but Karl Barth was a great activist.
Right.
Right?
Well, because you can't act. You can't act.
You can act and you must act.
But you don't think that
because you're witnessing. Yeah. And it's not part of any story.
You're not part of the engine of history. But I feel like I'm also in the Anglican tradition, and so I also want to have it both ways. But anyway, I feel like we should move on to, yes, George.
I'd like to lower the level of the discussion by asking about how one measures progress. If you graph the life expectancy over the last 200 years, it's roughly this. If you grasp calorie intake over the last 200 years, it's roughly this. Likewise, our average hours of education per person, same. Average hours of education per female person, like that. Average lifetime earnings of females.
I'm sorry, what I said about the Enlightenment, George.
So, and conversely, things like deaths from smallpox, and deaths from cholera, deaths from tuberculosis, like that. So most of these examples I've gotten from Stephen Pinker, who has many. But there are also plenty of negative trends. Number of guns, that's one of the number of hours spent in the correctional system is one of those. But I can't help wondering if the right way to discuss progress is to make careful measurements of trends, empirically You debate it and refine until you agree about them, basically, within the people having the conversation, and then balance them, one against the other. Some of them may actually be interdependent, in which case you decide whether to, what to do. In all cases, actually, the trends give you an indication of what to do. Should discussion progress be a little more empirical?
Anna.
So I really deeply disagree that the best thing has already happened. I think we wouldn't be here if that was true. And my question is, according to all of you on the panel or the audience, would there be a religious case to be made for progress? That in humility celebrates the greatness of the human mind, service to mankind, betterment of the world. Because we're sitting in Manhattan, where I'm from, in a little village where people don't have proper health care or electricity. Knowing that Jesus has come back once, not twice yet, it's not going to help them. It's their fellow men who help, who go there, who work, who build, who heal, who invent things. And I think that should also be at least given a good word.
I mean, there is...
To actually say, you made a really good point about all these metrics you talked about, and I wouldn't myself want to go back to the world before those metrics changed, and I think most people here would feel the same. But just that what Zach's comments and his initially pointed out is that despite achieving all these significant and very admirable changes, people seem to be not happy. There seems to be a lot of searching and questions. I think the problem is that... Yeah, well, I think the issue is that, we achieved all these great, incredible mastery over nature, which we've sought for basically the whole human race. Well, actually, I should say, since we started thinking it was possible to do so. But I think that some aspects of tradition, which we liked before, which kept us grounded and happy, were tossed out with the bathwater somehow. So I think the goal is how do we have material progress with the good aspects of tradition. And when measuring progress, I think there's also another problem, and Ross Douthat writes about this. He said that historically, societies always had a frontier that they could orient themselves towards. So you could judge progress by how much of the frontier you brought into your own ambit, or civilized according to your own standards, or brought, made your own in a way. But now the whole earth is actually been met. It's like pretty much a closed system now. So in the absence of a frontier, people maybe will draw inward instead, and their self will be the frontier. So you have to chart new frontiers of the self and self-actualization and so forth. And I think that's actually a recipe for making potentially unhappy, maybe. That's also part of it, and I think it's one of many causes. Space could be a frontier, but we're not all we cannot really, each individually is so involved or can be involved in that, and I think resources not devoted to that. But I think those aspects of it too, like these things what you're saying is absolutely 100% true, and to deny that would be wrong. It's just that why, despite all those achievements, are we having this conversation? Why is it a salient conversation with so many people? And I think something is missing that we've lost while achieving these things.
Well, one thing I'll briefly offer, I think we're having this conversation in large part because the graphs kind of go like this, all the way up and then a little notch down, right? Yeah. So especially with like life expectancy kinds of things, right? There has been this something is up that the chart stopped going up in the right way, and so we're all freaking out about it. And I think it actually provides a good opportunity to rethink things like, what do we mean by progress in the first place, right? Why do we have to think of time in terms of history at all, right? I mean, it's interesting how even just a little notch like that can raise some really profound questions. But.
Yeah, there's just to sort of get back to Anna. Sorry. I mean, there is a Christian tradition that would say absolutely yes, we can expect physical and moral progress from the world, which is postmillennialism. The idea is the millennium is now, and Jesus came into the world and spread new ways of both his supernatural power and also new ways of thinking about people and their value and their dignity, and that keeps sort of trickling down, and we can expect things to get better. So there is. I just want to say there is a kind of there is an account.
Why can't it get better?
They can, no.
Caps it.
Well, no. I mean, post-millennial Christians would say no one caps it. Like that's how things get better completely.
Sam, did you want to respond?
If I may, just in some context, I'm writing a book with Columbia about the Christian and philosophical origins of transhumanism.
And I think to just throw a bomb into the conversation the way Bart did into his, I think we should accept as a radical premise that we don't have a choice about believing in progress. Progress is the framework of globalism, and globalism must be dealt with at the scale at which it operates. Localist options are an essential part, I think every wise person agrees, of a better society. But the people who control the world literally must deal with global systems, the flow of capital, the flow of nation-state jurisdictions, international disputes. Where do these laws come from? As Professor Lilla said, the Christian legal tradition. Think about Germany, influenced by Savigny, the neo-Kantian legal tradition. It goes back to Kant, perpetual peace. All the great German idealist philosophical writing on history is essentially the most profound work in Christian eschatology. So the context for the rise of a belief in a universal good, like you were saying, Joey, and this is the radical vision of Christianity, that the Christian society should be responsible for the universal welfare of the species. Such a vision exists in no other religious tradition that was operationalized as part of a self-conscious imperial project. So it's a simple fact that the imperial global structure of the world is the manifestation of the Christian eschatological vision, debated endlessly. Read books 3 and 4 of Leviathan. In the Kingdom of Darkness, Hobbes does not want there to be temporal power because he's an anti-republican. Then read Milton. The Republicans are radical. Kings don't want one king. Kings don't want Jesus to come back. Republicans like Milton believed very fervently that one of the reasons republicanism was the right position, you guys probably know Eric Nelson's work on this, on the Hebrew Republic, is exactly because we have no right, if we say we believe in Jesus, to bow to any other king but he. And Hobbes hated that. So these eschatological debates about the future being now or deferred are always debates about the meaning of the Messiah. We exist in a perpetually messianic context. Look around, Dune, the most epic, wide-scale, successful movie, beautifully produced, the Avatar series, 20 years of cartoon, now a full-length series, the Netflix show Messiah. Messianic consciousness is more pervasive in so-called non-religious culture, like Tara, your work points out, than it is all the Christians have given up on it. So I think whatever position we take, I think we have to accept if we don't have an account of progress that's better than Elon Musk, or better than Mark Andreessen, or better than those people who actually are taking us to the stars, then why should they listen to any of us? And I say that as one of the people who's very skeptical of progress. I say this not as my position, but maybe just as a radical reframing of sort of that we must take into account a global vision. And the final thought on this is there's a great book translated into 13 languages by Vittorio Hussain, the great German philosopher, that he gave at the Moscow Academy of Sciences, called Die Philosophie der ökologischen Krise. The only language I know it's not in is English, so Colleen and I are going to translate it this year. He gave it in the 90s, and he points out two facts that he thinks all rational people have to deal with. The result of the nuclear discoveries mean we have the capacity to destroy the world, so we must be, as humans, responsible for that power. That is an undeniable power. So if we think of progress as the growth of power, no one can debate the power we have achieved. If we're not willing to take responsibility for it, we cede it to the worst elements of society. And then secondly, we will, by our own technological society, destroy the world ecologically. And we have that power. And we have to somehow take responsibility for that too.
That's all upside down. I mean, everything was right in what you said, I think, except when you said that, you know, we sort of have to meet the competition. What the Christian tradition offers, and I won't speak for others, is an alternative to even thinking about ourselves and our condition in relation to that. The answer to all these debates about progress and fighting about modernity is preach the gospel, period. Preach the gospel and show people that the other direction, you know, there's that, you know, we live in not only on the horizontal plane, but on the vertical plane. And that the escape from it is vertical. It is not forward or back.
I mean,
and I agree with everything you said up until then. I thought it was an advertisement for saying, you know, leave all that behind and follow me. Drop your nets.
I mean, it seems that one of the questions that I'm sort of is interestingly teased out from the question of faith and progress becomes what is the role of the person of faith in in affecting the shape of history, which is, I think, is coming out from what we're all discussing here from different perspectives, which is if we have certain kinds of theological anthropologies that orient us towards a sense of the eternal, what does that mean for our actions in history? And does that mean we have either responsibility, what responsibilities might we have or not have to it? I don't agree with you, but you make a compelling case. However, I do think my instinct there and my concerns there are also practical, which is to say, I think any kind of version of getting oneself in positions of global power in order to enact particular, even the version of the world we think is best, requires us to get close to the halls of power, and I cannot imagine a way of getting close to the halls of power that is not like bad for the soul, And then I'm sure we can posit someone who is sort of takes upon themselves the sort of the sins of whatever it takes to get to either political power or economic power. But chances are it's not good for the individual soul. And then how do we think about then it? Is there a sort of Christian effective altruism that we can sort of hypothetically posit?
Effective altruism.
Okay. that says, what matters is sort of particular outcomes for the world, be they material or be they ideological, or is the kind of either localism or even some kind of spiritual individualism the sort of necessary path of a person with belief in faith in the eternal. I feel like the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Just an instinct that I have, which is to say, it seems to me ridiculous and anti-human to imagine, from a Christian perspective, that there is no sort of ethical obligation I have to make the world better. That there is sort of no way that I must participate in politics, small p politics in some case. And yet it does seem to me, and this is purely sort of instinct, that my job is not to sort of become president and fix the world. And so I guess I'm curious how we see our role in history relative to the concept of an eternity and of a moral eternity.
Joey, I think you were gonna.
I'm glad you mentioned Hobbes. Well, and I'll also say, one of the other curiosities is it turns out that we do live in the shadow of a bunch of thinkers, right? Whose visions of the world have shaped our very way of approaching these kinds of questions. Hobbes is one of these guys. Hobbes is like maybe the earliest progress guy, and his vision of progress is that we'll all be gradually the commodious living that's authorized by a Leviathanic state will gradually make us care less about religious superstitions. So he had a vision of he's the guy who gave us the world we live in, basically, right? Where we'll all have stuff, we'll stop caring so much about miracles and things like that, and we'll all be fat and happy, and it'll all be great. The one thing I'll offer is that it seems to me that early modern political philosophy, especially, but also the stuff you see in Bacon, is less, or maybe it's an accidental continuation of a lot of the same impulses of Christianity, but they were acting against it explicitly, and they were very Epicurus is the guiding guy. Hobbes is very deeply Epicurean. Bacon has this Epicurean thing. There's something weird happening with Epicurus and Lucretius in early modern philosophy. That's this whole, we can fight it out afterwards, but the early modern guys are really, in a certain sense, angry about at least doctrinal Christianity and the kinds of disputes that it causes. And their way out is they're trying to make us all fat and stop caring about these kinds of ideas, right?
Where's Anna?
Yeah, we're...
Anna. Okay. Well, she wanted to know about, working hard to make the world better. One other difference that Joseph Smith introduced to his Christian brethren is a radically optimistic view of human nature. Very, very different than original sin emphasis. So positive about our capacity to become and to do good. He thought we could become gods. And that theosis is the project of human life. And that this earth is heaven. And we are intended to transform this earth through our virtue.
And I mean, I'm not sure if you know about the Mormon transhumanists, but there are a lot of them.
Yeah,
and
they're in my texts right now.
And I mean, obviously, the Protestantism and Catholicism also have an idea of theosis is just radically different.
Yeah.
I mean, what you were describing is the kind of like Stuart Brand thing, like we are as gods, we might as well get good at it, which sounds great, except that, and I do think there's like a mission of humanity to sort of mediate divine power in a good way. But that also is like, we are as gods, we might as well get good at it, is like absolutely Tolkien's ring. It is absolutely satanic in another level, which is what Professor Lillo was kind of getting at. Like that is what, I now have a sort of vision of like Tolkien as a kind of Bardian, which is probably wrong. But anyway, where is Anna? I feel like we should wrap up, so I'm going to take like 2 more questions. Yes?
Hi. I just wanted to make a comment and see what any of you think about it, but you know, I'm a historian, and people will sometimes ask, like, is progress the rule of history? And I always say I can't answer that because it's circular. Like, you can always look back at the past and see that things have changed, and you can always look back and compare past times to your own and say things are so much better. But what are the criteria of judgment you're using to say this is better than what I see in the past? Those criteria and those values you're using are a product of the present, and they're a product of those same historical processes that you're looking at. So of course, it's easy to just automatically say, well, of course things are better now than they were then, because you are a product of the present and you are judging according to the values of the present. And I think, at least going back the last 300 years, I know it gets, I'll try not to paint with too broad a brush, but any period you can always find people saying, this is the most enlightened time, this is the greatest time to live of any time in history. And then you can always find people rejecting that and saying, no, this is the worst, the most decadent, the most depraved. And often they're just reflecting back in negative form the same values, they're just inverting them, right? Mm-hmm. And creating an opposite trajectory of history. And it seems very easy to get caught in just one or the other of those poles and not step back and say, what are the criteria I'm using and how did I end up thinking and judging and valuing in this way? And to me, that seems like the big question that I wonder from everyone from this panel is like, how do you step out and how do you feel confident that you are, that in the criteria and the values that you're using to judge our time versus some future or past time, how do you feel that you are just reflecting, you know, you are just a product of our moment, our place and time?
You go ahead.
Yeah,
it's your birthday.
Very briefly. It's a great question, Sam. So I grew up, because the Mormon Restoration requires that there was a great apostasy. I was really taught that the Catholic Church was the great and abominable church. My dad was a missionary in Argentina, and he would tell me about that, the idol-worshiping Catholics. And I just really grew up, like, that's what I was taught. Catholics were just really wrong about everything. And then I went on a study abroad to France, and I walked into Chartres Cathedral. And I thought, this is the most amazing, beautiful place I've ever been. And everything I've been taught is wrong. And in fact, the modern world is not better than this. And that cathedral has guided my whole life, really. And George, you asked what indices would tell us if we're making progress. Cathedrals per capita, newly built and refurbished with stained glass would be my index of choice.
I think we have probably time for one more question. Should we? Yeah. Go for it.
Over the past 150 years, the secular world has come up with a pretty compelling cosmogony, Big Bang, evolution, yada yada, and the religions of the world have had to deal with that in some way. Now seems there might be a pretty compelling secular eschatology, like climate change or rogue AI, or we all get uploaded and become immortal computers. How are we going to integrate that? Will we integrate that? What does it look like?
Wasn't that cosmogony actually like a Jewish Christian thing? actually, that the right,
I mean, like,
the initial
evolution
impulse of,
specifically.
because the previous thing was that the universe is eternal and permanent, and the real change is that it was created, right? So, I mean, they've secularized it, but it seems like that the idea, at least, has come out of a religious tradition.
Yeah, I don't necessarily mean like a change in the shape. I just mean a change in the content of the narrative.
Sure, that's fair.
Tara, you've written about this stuff.
Yeah. I guess I'm not convinced that what calls sort of secular eschatology is at all incompatible with at least sort of, I can speak only from a Christian perspective here, a sort of a Christian sense of how the world might end. Which is to say, I think that there is, and again, I think like eschatology is, it's impossible to speak of a Christian eschatology because I think it's among the most sort of diffuse and diverse theological places, denomination to denomination.
Gonna be so many amazing heavens out there.
I mean, how the world ends. But I think the idea that human action, and particularly prideful human action, that our attempt to control nature or to have certain kinds of mastery over ourselves, one another, and the earth might backfire quite badly, feels, I think, insofar as it accords with, it certainly accords with Christian theological anthropology. To the extent that I think that I don't think that Christianity or Christians need to kind of radically reshape our view of the end times because the likely existential risks to the human condition have or appear in the cultural consciousness in these extremely specific ways, which is to say, I mean, I hope they don't happen.
Yeah.
And I probably think it's like reasonably likely that they will happen. But I think that the way to understand that is through, again, the moral, like a moral lens, a theological lens, a lens of the eternal. This is what we as human beings have kind of always done and will keep doing until we make it impossible for ourselves so to do. I don't think we can we create the existential AI and we trigger Christ coming back. I don't think it works like that. I certainly don't suggest we try it. But I think it's precisely like I think that theological anthropology is more important than specific eschatological outcomes in reading and assessing and engaging with the kinds of existential risks that appear to be on the horizon at this present moment.
Yeah. I feel like this is literally just only now getting good, which is really frustrating. I mean, this is...
Ouch! Susannah.
No, I didn't mean that. I love you all so much. Happy birthday, Zach. That's not what I meant. I meant this has been getting good and it's getting better, and it's like eschatologically going to keep getting better until we all like do theosis, but in like not in a Mormon way because I'm a Protestant. Anyway,
some of us in a Mormon.
Yeah. Okay. I do want to end with this, and then I think we're going to have a drinks and hangout time, or what are we going to do? Okay, we're not. Okay, what are we going to do?
We have the space for a little bit more,
okay.
And then it becomes an improvisation.
Okay, we're going to improvise, but I'm going to end with something that I think everyone in this little bit, everyone here, all of our religious traditions would regard this as scripture. I think this is from Ecclesiastes. God has made everything.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming out.